Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good afternoon. Our first item of business today is Time for Reflection, and our Time for Reflection leader is Mr. George Innes from the Gideons.
Mr. Presiding Officer, members of the Scottish Parliament, thank you for the opportunity to share with you this afternoon. In the year 1899, in the state of Wisconsin in the United States of America, 3 men met together to form an organisation that would facilitate the free availability of the Word of God, primarily in hotels. Thus, the Gideon ministry began. Today, Gideons are represented in over 200 countries worldwide, with the Bible translated in over 95 languages and placed in every traffic lane of life. It was in the year 1949 that the British Isles National Association was formed, and this year we celebrate 70 years of God's faithfulness to us. Our sole objective is that everyone has the opportunity to freely read the Bible, which we believe are the Maker's instructions for life. These Bibles are on duty 24/7, whether at a hotel or hospital bedside, a prison cell, or on a North Sea oil rig. The Where to Find Help section at the front deals with every experience in life, directing the reader to words of advice, help, instruction, warning, comfort, hope, correction, direction, predictions and promises. Above all, a knowledge of Jesus Christ, hope for the future, peace of mind, and an assurance of eternal life. We are greatly encouraged to frequently receive personal testimonies of how a Gideon Bible has changed a life, often without human intervention. Keeping a pace of our digital age, we also have a Gideon Bible app offering mobile access to scriptures in a multitude of languages. Once known as the land of the book, Scotland has a rich Christian heritage. During these former days of obedience to God's word, Scotland was richly blessed, sending missionaries all over the world and significantly contributing globally in the fields of engineering, science, medicine, banking, economics, and education. Today, nationally and internationally, as we face immense challenges morally, politically, financially, socially, and spiritually, it is our passionate belief that we need to turn to God's word for peace and stability, personally and collectively. Please be assured that the Gideons UK pray for you all in this Scottish Parliament, committing you each to God's care and guidance as you faithfully serve. Personally, over the past 30 years as a Gideon, every aspect of service has been a joy and privilege, but none greater than placing this little red New Testament and Psalms into the hands of a secondary one school pupil, offering them sure foundation in a world fraught with pitfalls. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next item of business is topical questions. And our first question from Bruce Crawford.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what the implications are for its budget of the general election and the postponement of the UK budget.
Cabinet Secretary Derek Mackay.
The general election on the 12th of December has forced us to cancel our plans to publish the Scottish budget on that day, and the uncertainty caused by the postponed UK budget continues indefinitely. I agree with the Finance and Constitution Committee's view that the Scottish budget should optimally be published after the UK budget, and the consequence of this is that the 2020-21 Scottish budget will not publish before Christmas. I am mindful of the importance of parliamentary scrutiny time around the Scottish budget and will continue to work with the committee to agree a new budget date as soon as possible.
Bruce Crawford.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that without tax policy announcements of a UK budget and the tax, social security and economic forecasts produced by the OBR, the Scottish Government simply cannot know how much money is available to spend in 2021? Therefore, can the Cabinet Secretary please tell me what representations have been made to the Tory Government about this very challenging situation? Do they comprehend the scale of the problem? And if so, what response has he had?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Mr Crawford's analysis is quite right. Without the tax policy announcements of a UK budget and the tax, social security and economic forecast produced by the OBR for a UK budget, which determine the block grant adjustments, the Scottish Government simply cannot know how much money is available to spend next year. And without a new date for the UK budget, we don't know when that certainty will come. So I have written to both the Chief Secretary of the Treasury and the Chancellor, prospective Chancellor, earlier this month to express concern and to stress that the UK budget should proceed as soon as possible after the general election, as well as the need for early dialogue and information sharing with the Scottish Government after the election. Now, I have not had a reply to these letters and therefore do not know UK Ministers' comprehension of the situation. But I'm sorry to say, I fear they aren't too interested in the effective working of devolution or the public services of Scotland.
Bruce Crawford.
I thank again, Cabinet Secretary. Can the Cabinet Secretary also confirm there remains the issue of interaction of taxes between the UK Government and the Scottish Government, which can cause significant difficulties for Scottish tax policy if the UK Government has not set its tax policy first? Does he agree that in order for the Scottish budget to take place in an orderly fashion, it's essential the UK budget takes place as soon as possible after the general election? And what are the consequences for Scottish public services if the UK budget is delayed beyond the very beginning of the calendar year?
Cabinet Secretary.
In detail, the UK budget contains a number of important pieces of information for devolution and for the devolved and partially devolved taxes. And without this, it's more difficult for the Scottish Government to set our budget. We don't have the block grant adjustments based on the most up-to-date forecast and the latest UK policy intentions. And of course, let's bear in mind there may be a difference between announced election intentions from prospective UK governments and what actually features in a spending review or indeed a budget. So I do agree that it's essential that the UK budget takes place as soon as possible after the general election. As I've said, I have emphasised that point to the Treasury. I was alerting concerns to the Treasury about other matters. If they want to see devolution working successfully, they have to engage seriously in this and understand our processes as well. But the consequences for the delay to public services are important because that uncertainty continues for local government and public bodies, both around substantive budgets that they would wish to know, and many, of course, public sector employers would need to consider pay remits and dialogue with trade unions and others with effect from the 1st of April. So I will continue to engage with the unions, COSLA and others on the budget process, but we do need the UK Government to act as quickly as they can post-election. And my officials will continue to work with committee clerks and the Scottish Fiscal Commission, who have engaged in this matter, on contingency options around the budget process and timetable, so that we can productively use the time before the UK general election to have us as well placed as possible to respond to different scenarios. But failure of the UK Government to engage in this matter is very severe to Scotland's public services.
Dean Lockhart to be followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is a slight hint of hypocrisy in the SNP complaining about a delayed budget, when, after all, they also voted to have an early general election. According to a recent Fraser-Valander report, Scottish income tax revenues are on track to disappoint relative to the rest of the UK, and as a result, despite the block grant from Westminster increasing by over 2%, the overall budget available to the Scottish Government will increase by less than 1%. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with the Fraser-Valander analysis?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the important point for the Conservatives to understand is the Tories who have continually proposed, I'm not referring to the general election, but over the course of specifically, but over the course of continuous budgets, the Tories have proposed tax cuts for the rich in society, and that would lead to cuts in spending for our public services. Our progressive tax policy has actually raised revenues to be able to invest in our public services. And in terms of cancellation of the UK Government's budget, the UK Government could have gone earlier if they so desired. If they wanted, they could have gone earlier. But it would appear that the Prime Minister's track record was that he couldn't get anything through Westminster, never mind the chaos of a budget failing as well. This has been the track record of a UK Government that has been incompetent, chaotic, and that may well have led to a chaotic budget process as well. In having a general election, the key point is we are where we are now, but there is nothing to stop the UK Government proceeding as quickly as possible, because I understand their budget was all ready. It was good to go, I understand it. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. But if it is the case that any incoming UK Government, whoever it may be, should proceed with the budget as quickly as possible so that this Parliament can properly consider matters that are devolved to us in setting out our tax and spending proposals, and that this Parliament can properly scrutinise those proposals as well. And it must not be left to the last minute by the UK Government with all the negative consequences that that would have for the people of Scotland. And that's why I'm encouraging the action that I am for Treasury to take in these circumstances.
Rhoda Grant to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Councils need to set their budgets and council tax, and that's time limited. We're also having new devolved powers over social security, which would prevent them being part of a roll-on budget. The Cabinet Secretary talked about scenario planning for different scenarios. When will he share those scenario plans with the Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, again, I'm engaging with the Finance Committee to set out an agreed timetable that can be mutually agreed with Parliament, recognising that we need a bespoke, and the Finance Committee recognises this as well, a bespoke process that gets us through these unprecedented circumstances. I share the concern around timely settlements to local government, and I know that I've engaged with opposition spokespeople, and I appreciate the consensual approach to that. But there are matters that people need to understand. We don't have a simple mechanism that would allow the rollover from one financial year to the next. These circumstances were not foreseen by the signatories and, of course, creators of the Scotland Act, whereas if we do not pass a rate resolution, we raise no income tax. That would be catastrophic to the public services of Scotland. We, of course, need to pass the non-domestic rates resolution and necessary orders as well. Indeed, the local government financial settlements. So there are many significant matters that cannot be wished away by those that think there's an easy alternative process. So I will present a budget as soon as I possibly can to Parliament, in agreement with, hopefully in agreement with the parliamentary authorities and the Finance and Constitution Committee as we work within these circumstances. And I said in the medium-term financial strategy the range of determinants that would set out an impact on our fiscal plans, and that's actually come true in terms of the risks and the volatility and the variables that we wrestle with. But I'll continue to engage with opposition spokespeople to try and ensure that we have a process that can get us through this in a very effective, consensual and cohesive manner. But whatever we do, and I call upon all parties in this chamber in these unprecedented circumstances, let's work together to ensure that there is no risk to the revenues and expenditure for our public services. And whatever we do, we work together to address the volatility, uncertainty and chaos that's been foisted upon us by the UK Government, and work to ensure that devolution can deliver even in these exceptional circumstances.
Patrick Harvey.
If we are still waiting partway through January for a UK budget to be published, what is the last time, the last date on which the Scottish Government can make a decision about whether it may need to proceed to attempt to introduce a Scottish budget in the absence of a UK one? And if we are in that scenario of having to try to debate a budget without a UK budget in place and potentially with emergency bill procedures, surely it is just one more example, not only of political contempt from the UK Government, but also of a fundamentally dysfunctional fiscal framework which needs to be fundamentally redesigned.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I agree with Patrick Harvey's fundamental point there, and it's one that I had already alerted to the Treasury and to the Finance Committee, that even before the cancellation of the UK budget, I was already of the view that with the experience that we now have, that the fiscal framework requires to be urgently reviewed. I was of that view before, but this has proven the case why it needs to be revisited as a matter of urgency. In terms of the circumstances in which, if the UK Government runs so late in terms of a UK budget, as the Finance Committee, of which Patrick Harvey's a member, if it runs so late as to present the kind of difficulties that I was outlining in an earlier answer, then it isn't impossible that the Scottish Government would proceed before the UK Government's budget. But that would bring considerable, and I do think almost unacceptable, risks to the process in terms of trying to arrive at the numbers that we're working with, the tax proposition that would be trying to second guess of the UK Government and other matters. And I do think that that would be a risky process. So we will impress upon the UK Government to set a UK budget and outline their policies as quickly as possible and, of course, respond to that, because that will give us an orderly approach to budget setting in Scotland. But I am so concerned about the risks of us going before the UK Government. I know the Finance Committee agree with that risk, and will continue to work with opposition spokespeople with a range of contingencies should it transpire that the UK Government is going to continue with this uncertainty by not even setting a budget, but not even setting a budget date, which is the position that we're now wrestling with the UK Government.
Thank you. Question number 2, Jamie Greene.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reports that NHS staff shortages are putting cancer survival rates at risk.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
I want to start by thanking the cross-party group for their helpful report and the recommendations which fairly set out the key challenges we face and the work we need to do. We've invested £1.6 million in radiotherapy training and staffing to date, meaning in the past 2 years we've seen significant increases in patients accessing modern radiotherapy. We've seen the number of consultants with a speciality of clinical radiology working in the health service in Scotland increasing by over 45% since September 2006, and with 290 more training places in place since 2014. Earlier this month, I announced a further 70 additional training places to be recruited in 2020 in key specialisms, including radiology and oncology. All of these staff and many others are working hard to deliver the high quality of care our patients need, which produces the 95% of patients rating their overall experience of cancer care positively.
Jamie Greene.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that update and add my thanks to the cross-party group who did an excellent job with this report, and the organisations who were involved in the drafting of it. It was very considered and measured and informative for MSPs. But that report did find that by June this year, 1 in 5 cancer patients were not seen within the 6-week target, a threefold increase in just 3 years, Cabinet Secretary. The report concluded quite clearly that on diagnostics, workforce issues seems to be the greatest concern of impacting outcomes, and it said that ministers must take urgent and sustained action to address shortfalls in long-term workforce planning. So, in addition to the comments made to my first answer, what action will the Cabinet Secretary take to ensure that radiology and oncology departments in Scotland are adequately staffed now, not just in the future? And will she commit to a date as to when we will expect the government's 6-week target to be met across all health boards?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, just on the latter part, I'm sure if Mr Greene cares to refresh his memory with the waiting times plan that I published about a year ago, he'll be able to see when that date actually is, because it's set out in great detail in that plan. In terms of the report has 3 key recommendations. I'd just like to update you briefly on those. Develop a national model of workforce planning. I have made the commitment that our national workforce plan, in addition to the other workforce plans that we have already published, that the integrated national workforce plan will be published before Christmas recess. Unlock the potential benefits of linked patient data. This is really a critical part of the report with which I couldn't agree more. It is, of course, easier to write than it is to do. These matters are complex, but I'm sure members will be pleased to know that we have almost reached an agreement on joint data controller and data sharing, and deliver a step change in the provision of holistic cancer patient services. And of course, our joint £18 million in total work with Macmillan Cancer does precisely that in providing that holistic wraparound service. Final 2 points, Presiding Officer, if I may. I do think it's worth noting that our 31 diagnosis to treatment target has been met at 96.5%. That will be 1.5% over the target in this Q2, which was September 2019. So progress continues to be made, and indeed on the 62-day target. And my final point is to let the member know, I'm sure he'll be delighted by this, that in terms of medical trainee recruitment, the stats for 2019, the final stats, tell me that in clinical radiology, ST1 recruitment has a 100% fill rate. So progress is being made, Presiding Officer, more to do, but as you'll see, we are utterly committed to delivering that.
Jamie Greene.
The Cabinet Secretary is right. There is more to do. There is much more to do, as the statistics show. And behind every statistic is a cancer patient who's waiting to be diagnosed and to be treated. And that's the reality of the situation. Presiding Officer, the problem here is that consecutive health secretaries have been repeatedly warned about these challenges over the years. As far back as 2015, the Royal College of Radiologists issued warnings about low uptake of radiology. In 2017, an Audit Scotland report flagged similar workforce planning issues. And in 2018, a leading radiologist, Dr. Baxter Grant, warned that our services were on red alert. He went as far as saying that if we do not address these issues, there simply won't be a service in the next 3, 4 or 5 years. So let me ask, why, after years of repeated warnings from health professionals right across the sector, has such little progress been made? And will she formally respond in writing to the recommendations in the cross-party group's report?
Cabinet Secretary.
So all I can say, Presiding Officer, is it's a good job that this government listens a lot better than Mr Greene does. Yeah. I have answered all of those questions. Why do you think I gave you that factual information about what we've done since 2014, what we have done recently and the considerable progress that we made? And yes, you are absolutely right, Mr Greene. Behind every one of those statistics is a cancer patient waiting to be treated and cancer patients who are diagnosed. And I am more than you conscious of that. But I also know that behind all of those statistics are staff working hard every single day. Medical trainees, 100% fill rate in radiology. Those matters are important, they count, and progress is being made. And muttering at me from a sedentary position really won't take us much further. In terms of your final point, I will be delighted, and I know that the cross-party group know this, to respond in full to their report, which I've found very helpful, and to return to them, as I did in June, with a very constructive and helpful conversation that I've had with that cross-party group, and I look forward to doing that.
There are 3 other members who wish to ask supplementaries. Anas Sarwar, followed by Keith Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As co-convener of the cross-party group on cancer, can I start by thanking all 67 respondents to the inquiry, be that be charities, researchers, patients, clinicians or academics. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary would agree that this was a constructive report that is aimed to help and inform the government rather than to purely challenge it. Can I therefore ask whether she would endorse all 10 recommendations made in the report, and specifically on the point around vacancy rates and indeed how that's impacting on diagnosis? This year there were 16,000 patients that waited more than the 6-week time guarantee for their diagnostic test. That compares to just 4,000 patients 3 years ago. That's an exponential increase. What urgent action will the government take to look at not just recruitment, retention and training, but also how we use our technology and upskill existing clinicians also?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Sarwar for his question and indeed for his work in the cross-party group. I do completely agree that it is a very constructive and fair report, and I'm very happy here on the record to endorse all of the recommendations in that report, and I look forward to the discussion that we'll have on that. Of course, we have invested in capital in terms of radiotherapy equipment and other matters, 33 million from our £100 million cancer strategy going into radiotherapy, more money going into scope capacity and into surgical robots for prostate cancer plus others. So there's a capital issue, there's the training issue and the recruitment issue and the retention matters, but there is, as Mr Sarwar rightly says, also the question of redesigning the service and the pathway so that we can upskill existing clinicians and others to take on new roles, and we can look at how we streamline some of that work. My final point just on the streamlining is how we are, and we are doing this now, is looking at how we use the waiting times plan and the additional significant investment from that in order to group together our diagnostic capacity in certain areas so that we can speed up the time between necessary diagnostic tests in order to detect particular kinds of cancer. And again, very happy to update the CPG on that matter in due course.
Keith Brown, to be followed by Neil Findlay.
One of the issues raised by the report is the ageing population and the very real need to expand our NHS workforce to meet that anticipated increase in demand. As the only population increase, though, in Scotland comes from inward migration, and given the complete lack of acknowledgement, far less concern regarding the impact of their support for Brexit from the Tory benches in this Parliament, what assurances has the UK Government given that in the event of Brexit, Scotland will have the powers to deliver a tailored immigration system to ensure our NHS can recruit the specialists it needs long into the future?
Slightly tangential, but if the Minister can briefly respond.
I'm grateful to the member for that question. He is right to talk about immigration policy in the context of the recruitment and retention of staff. We know across our health service, across these benches, everyone has been happy to laud the work that our colleagues from the European Union mainland bring and do for us, the value of that and so on, as well as others from beyond these shores. But of course, if we do not control our own immigration policy and if we are dragged out of the European Union against our clearly stated democratic will, then that increases the workforce challenges that we have, but additional challenges too, Presiding Officer, in terms of clinical research and advancement in medicines and technology. So in answer to the member's question, the straightforward answer is, of course, the previous UK government, the one currently seeking re-election, has made absolutely no recognition of the special situation in Scotland, and indeed their proposition in particular on immigration, aside from being quite shameful and inhumane, would cause significant damage to the Scottish economy and to Scottish society as a whole. So I absolutely endorse all calls, as I know increasingly across parties and across Scotland people do, that Scotland should have the right to choose its own immigration policy, as we should indeed have the right to choose much more about our future besides.
And Neil Findlay.
Staff shortages across the NHS are putting lives and patients' health at risk, especially cancer patients. But as I discovered last week through an FOI request, staff shortages in Lothian are resulting in them having to pay up to £1,715 a shift to private agencies to cover vacancies. Cabinet Secretary, NHS Lothian predicts a £90 million budget deficit. It's paying £1.4 million a month for a hospital with no patients, and now this. So what do you say to my constituents, cancer patients and others, who are suffering because of the workforce crisis overseen by successive SNP ministers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think I've already answered much of what Mr Findlay says. The additional piece of information I'd give him, which was actually credit to his colleague Mr Sarwar, was the work that he and I were able to do in terms of the safe staffing legislation that looked at how we handled agency spend inside boards. And of course, when that legislation, now having received royal assent, commences, that will see a significant shift over time in how boards are able to use agency spend as opposed to investing in recruitment of full-time employees. And that will make a significant difference, I believe, to the work that's underway and to the overall sustainability of our health service.
Thank you. Question number 3, Andy Wightman.
Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what fire safety checks it has undertaken on the building cladding used in private student accommodation, including whether it has been checked for high-pressure laminate cladding.
Minister Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the events in Bolton at the weekend, I'm relieved that there was no loss of life, and I'd like to acknowledge the work of all of those who brought that fire under control. Student accommodation in Scotland is classed as relevant premises under the Fire Scotland Act 2005. This means that landlords, as duty holders, have responsibility for fire safety risk assessments. My officials wrote in June this year to a range of bodies, including the Scottish Funding Council, representing the colleges and universities, to raise awareness of cladding tests being commissioned by the UK Government, which may prove useful as part of such risk assessments. Any significant fire in a residential building is, of course, a concern for all of us. Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service have stated that their investigation into the Bolton fire will consider the role of external cladding played in the development and spread of the fire. Once that information is available, we will review any findings as part of our ongoing work on building and fire safety, and will take any appropriate action necessary.
Andy Wightman.
I thank the Minister for that answer. As he said, the fire brigade operated exemplary in bringing that fire under control, but it was an incredibly scary fire. The fire brigade also made clear in that instance that there was no ACM involved in that building, but eyewitness observations of the fire said, quote, crawling up the cladding like it was nothing. And I think that exacerbates the fears of everyone living in such buildings. The Minister mentioned fire risk safety assessments. Can he confirm to me whether these are available to the residents of the buildings that have been assessed?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, that particular aspect I cannot give an answer to directly to Mr Wightman at this moment in time. What I will do is I will write and give him a comprehensive response on that point and let him know what actually happens with those assessments.
Andy Webb.
Thank you. I think that would be extremely helpful because I've been speaking to students and student bodies who are extremely concerned as a consequence of the events in Bolton. The Ministerial Working Group indicated that there would be a creation of a public a database to maintain safety-critical information for existing high-rise residential buildings. And in the Minister's own evidence to the Local Government Committee on the 5th of September 2018, he talked about an inventory. Can he update us where we are with that inventory? And finally, what additional measures can the Scottish Government and its agencies put in place to reassure residents, in particular students, that while, of course, fire is always a risk, that building materials will never exacerbate those risks?
Minister.
First of all, on Mr Wightman's point about student bodies have written to the Government recently on this point, and I will cooperate with Ms Denham, the Community Safety Minister, to ensure that they get answers to the questions that they have asked. In terms of the inventory of high-rise buildings in Scotland is a piece of work which we have been completing. The inventory is being developed to provide a central source of information and overview of the key aspects of high-rise domestic buildings in Scotland, including all of their fire safety features. And the inventory does ask for information on cladding types, including high-pressure laminate, which has been mentioned previously. We will continue as a government to review all of this. The Ministerial Working Group is still meeting, and we have discussed many matters. And as and when more information and analysis comes to us, we will take the necessary steps to ensure that people are safe in buildings here in Scotland.
There are 3 members waiting patiently to ask questions. If they all ask a very brief question and similarly, hopefully a concise answer, we'll try and get through them. John Mason, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you. I wonder if the Minister can offer any reassurance to constituents of mine who live in buildings with ACM cladding and are unable to sell them at the moment, as well as being very worried.
Minister.
Presiding Officer, I think that Mr Mason may be talking about folks who have cladding on their buildings which are not made up of aluminium composite material, and the current situation that there is in difficulty in mortgage lending. I answered a question last week to Mr Balfour around about this. The Government is trying to seek solutions, but mortgage lending is a reserved matter to the UK. I've written twice now to the UK Secretary of State, Mr Jenrick, to try and gain some cooperation around about this. I recognise that there is a general election on the go at the moment, but there is also still a day job to do. My officials have also been in discussions with UK Finance and are having more meetings this week to try and reach resolution so that those folks who are finding difficulty in buying and selling their properties at this moment in time can be helped. I do hope that the UK Government will respond to our request for help to find a solution.
Sarah Boyack, to be followed by Graham Simpson.
What work has the Scottish Government done to assess whether local authorities have the staff and resources to ensure enforcement action can be taken where there are safety concerns from residents, whether they're students or general members of the public?
Presiding Officer, I am not aware of any difficulties that local authorities have had in responding to any request that the Government has made in terms of the multitudes of requests that there have been since the tragedy at Grenfell. I would like to thank very much all of the local authorities for their cooperation in all that they have done to the numerous questions that we have asked to ensure that people in Scotland are safe. In particular, I'd like to thank them for their cooperation in trying to put together the inventory of buildings, which will be very helpful in the future and will require us to ask less questions because that inventory needs to be updated on a regular basis so we know what's going on in these buildings right across the country.
Graham.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. In the light of Grenfell and the blaze in Bolton, does the Minister not agree with the Association of British Insurers that we must see a total ban on combustible materials being used on the outside of buildings?
Yes.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government, of course, had an external independent panel of experts looking at all of this. We will continue to take the advice of that panel. I think the key thing in all of this is ensuring that the right testing is done to make sure that not only do we have the right cladding and materials, but the fire stopping that is required in buildings is done properly in every single occasion. We will continue to review everything as we move forward. We will continue to take the expert advice that we have because our job is to ensure that everyone is safe in their buildings here in Scotland.
Thank you very much, Minister and colleagues. We're going to move on. That concludes topical questions. We're going to move on now to the next item of business, which is a statement by Marie Goujon on the International Year of Plant Health 2020. The Minister will take questions. If members wish to ask a question at the end of the statement, please press your request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on the Minister.
Presiding Officer, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to set out the plans we have to mark and celebrate International Year of Plant Health in 2020. This initiative of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization aims to protect plants globally and is described as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to raise global awareness on how protecting plant health can help end hunger, reduce poverty, protect the environment and boost economic development. Now, as the Minister with responsibility for plant health, I'm determined that Scotland plays its part and seizes this opportunity. Now, plant health is probably not something that many of you will have given much thought to, and I'm pretty sure it won't be coming up very often on the doorsteps. But plant health is critical to our very existence. It's a fundamental building block for our economy, and it's crucial to the environment and biodiversity. Quite simply, plant health matters. Here in Scotland, healthy plants are estimated to be worth around £19.2 billion to the rural economy every year. They help make Scotland the country we all know and love. And they underpin tourism, scientific study, medicine and leisure and recreational activities, as well as communities' sense of place and cohesion and people's physical and mental health and well-being. I can't imagine a Scotland in autumn without its woodland coat of many colours, without the white sweep of blackthorn blossom and hills of purple heather in spring, nor one without the sharp, sweet taste of locally grown raspberries and strawberries in the summer. Freedom of movement of goods and people undoubtedly brings huge benefits for Scotland, but globalisation increases the risk of new pests and diseases reaching us. Plant health threats can travel hidden in nursery plants and the compost they grow in plant products, packaging, wood, vehicles and holidaymakers' luggage, even in the soil carried on our shoes. There are already over 1,000 pests and diseases threatening the health of plants in the UK, across forestry, crops and the natural environment. And the number of threats continues to increase due to climate change and trade globalisation. For example, the common ash tree is under real threat from Callera ash dieback, a fungus which is fatal to the species and which has already decimated populations in England and is predicted to kill 95 to 99% of ash trees in the UK. It will cost an estimated £15 billion to the UK in operational costs and lost benefits such as water and air purification and carbon sequestration. The total cost is 50 times larger than the annual value of trade in live plants to and from the UK. But it is the lost benefits to society which is said to be the biggest cost. We have legislation in place to prevent the movement of ash trees, plants and seeds, which will help to slow the spread of this fungus to uninfected areas. In 2018, we also introduced a Callera action plan agreed with stakeholders which sets out our key priorities around research, surveillance and monitoring, prophylactic and reactive measures and communications to best minimise the impacts of this disease. However, there is a glimmer of hope on the horizon with the news just yesterday that a study has identified the genes which give trees resistance to the disease, which, while it won't help those trees which are currently affected, could help future populations. Likewise, there is a real threat of an outbreak of the bacterium Xylella, which has over 560 identified host species and is decimating crops in parts of Europe. If it arrives in Scotland, it will have a devastating impact on our trade in plants and trees and our wider environment, creating economic loss in the process. And only just last week, here in Scotland, experts were advising that potato cyst nematode, an ongoing concern due to its longevity in the soil once introduced. This could potentially wipe out our seed potato industry by 2025 if the rate of land lost to this pathogen continues at its current rate. We test all soils being used to produce seed potatoes for this pathogen, but we need to work collaboratively with industry and researchers to find a sustainable solution to protect this industry. We must continue to invest in science, research, monitoring and testing, but we must all play our part in minimising and mitigating the risks to plant health, not least as part of our fight against climate change. Presiding Officer, we simply cannot afford to do nothing, not least because plants and trees are our greatest allies in the fight against climate change. As nature's barometers, they tell us so much about the world and our own changing temperatures, and will help us adapt to climate change and to mitigate it by sequestering and storing greenhouse gases. Scotland's forests are a significant carbon sink, absorbing around 9.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. That is why we're committed to planting 24 million trees this next year. But that's not all we're doing. We published a plant health strategy in 2016, setting out our approach to protecting plants across Scotland and improving biosecurity. In 2017, the Scottish Government appointed the first ever Scottish Chief Plant Health Officer to provide strategic leadership across all plant health sectors. We also established a new virtual plant health centre for Scotland in 2018 to coordinate activity across sectors, to monitor plant diseases and help stakeholders understand how to improve their own plant health capabilities. The centre has already strengthened our contingency plans against key threats, such as the bacterium Xylella, and has informed on the impact to agriculture from the withdrawal of the pesticide metaldehyde. This spring, we published a new forestry strategy for Scotland, setting out a 50-year vision for Scotland's forests and woodlands, with a 10-year action framework to continue to grow and protect our trees, woods and forests. And every year, the Scottish Government provides core funding of £47 million to Scotland's research institutes and invests £7 million in plant health research to fill evidence gaps across all sectors. Our world-leading plant scientists, such as those at the James Hutton Institute, have long benefited from international research funding and collaborations that have contributed to plant health solutions. We will use International Year of Plant Health to showcase our role as part of a vibrant international research community. Of course, we also enter 2020 with huge uncertainty about the impact of Brexit on that international activity. We face the loss of scientists who have come to work and live in Scotland, many of whom I've met in recent months. We can never say often enough that they are welcome here and we want them to stay. And we know that Brexit has diminished others' enthusiasm to collaborate with Scottish institutions on research projects and funding applications. The loss, too, of being part of one of the world's very best scientific communities, with free and ready access to up-to-date science and evidence and protections through EU-wide regulations and standards, threatens to compromise our ability to protect Scotland's plants and trees. Presiding Officer, this Government is determined to keep pace with EU standards and regulations and will do all it can to prevent our high standards being compromised by trade deals designed in a race to the bottom by future UK governments. We will not allow the strides made in building resilience against plant health threats to be undone. Instead, we will resolve to use the International Year of Plant Health as a platform upon which to build. We plan to engage with industry, scientists, other organisations and the public, and particularly with children and young people. It is vital that we educate and enthuse them about the role plants have to play in securing their future and to inspire their interest and curiosity, while also encouraging behaviours which we want them to take into work and life in adulthood. This would provide a lasting legacy for the International Year of Plant Health in Scotland. So, Forestry and Land Scotland and the National Trust for Scotland host children's bug hunts throughout the year at a range of venues, and we will participate in some of Scotland's science festivals with plant-themed activities. Every person can make a difference, even with small changes and actions, and that is the message we will be promoting through International Year of Plant Health. The Scottish Government and its partners will spend more time showing the public, especially the nation's gardeners, how they can help protect Scotland's biosecurity. We will therefore join forces with the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh to help celebrate its 350th year in 2020 with a year-long biosecurity exhibition in the John Hope Gateway. The Scottish Government will host a plant health conference in March, and there will be a series of industry roundtable events to explore current and emerging threats to plant health. Presiding Officer, this provides just a snapshot of some of the activities that are currently being planned to celebrate and mark International Year of Plant Health. I'm hopeful too that there will be activity in Parliament and activity that all members can engage with. And I'm happy to update Parliament with more detail of the planned programme as it develops. But I just hope that today we can agree that ensuring Scotland is fully involved in International Year of Plant Health is not just a good use of our time and energy, but an essential one. It will allow us to share our often world-leading research and science in this area, with the threats to plant health increasing and the impacts of an outbreak potentially devastating. It will allow us to spread the message to safeguard our plants, and it will enable us to raise awareness and understanding of the critical role plants and trees play in our everyday life, not least to tackle climate change. Presiding Officer, I look forward to working with members across the Chamber to make our programme for International Year of Plant Health a success.
Thank you very much. The Minister will now take questions. Finlay Carson to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank the Minister for early sight of her statement, and I welcome the opportunity we all have in 2020 to celebrate the Year of Plant Health and raise awareness of the importance of plant health to the economy and indeed the natural environment and biodiversity of Scotland. Particularly now when the State of Nature 2019 reported that of the 6,413 species found in Scotland, 11% are currently threatened with extinction, highlighting that Scotland's wildlife has declined substantially in the recent decades. Data is very, very important, but I do question the priority this government places on research and data collection, given that last year, Aileen Wilson, the chair of the Scottish Biodiversity Information Forum, urged the Scottish Government to establish integrated local and national structures for collecting, analysing and sharing biological data to inform decision-making processes to benefit biodiversity. But as we heard in the Clare Committee back in September, there remains real concerns over the lack of funding. Ellen Wilson, a year on, stated, "We've heard brilliant words that are not often backed up with sufficient sustainable funding that would take the pressure off the network." Can the Minister give us assurance that this statement we've heard today just isn't about brilliant words, but ensures that we have the funding and a national data collection structure in place to ensure we have accurate data available in order to make the best interventions to safeguard plant health and in turn tackle our biodiversity emergency?
Minister.
I would agree. I mean, the member is absolutely right in terms of we are in a biodiversity emergency, and I don't think I need to explain to anybody in this chamber just what an emergency we're in and the kind of situation that we face. I mean, together with the State of Nature report, we also had the IPBES report earlier in the year, which states that about 1 million species are expected to become extinct if we don't take action now to tackle both climate change and biodiversity, because the two, of course, are intrinsically linked. I mean, that is why we do put such an emphasis. I took a question from the member about invasive non-native species in portfolio questions a couple of weeks ago. That's why we do put such a focus on tackling things such as invasive non-native species. And again, as the member raised, the research element of that is so vitally important. I visited forestry research just recently to hear about the work that they do. And that's where the Plant Health Centre and some of the work that I talked about in my statement today, they're so vitally important. And we're really leading the way in that, because that brings together the scientific community to really look at what our needs are in terms of research so that we can prioritise and continue to be the world leaders that I believe that we are.
Claudia Beamish to be followed by Gail Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Minister for prior sight of the statement and welcome the UNFAO's ambition and the International Year of Plant Health. I agree with the Minister that these are very significant issues both here and abroad, and protecting our plant health means resilience in itself, which is also imperative in securing the right to food for all and so much more. In our increasingly globalised world, what measures is the government taking to improve action on biosecurity specifically across all departments and levels of government? And the Brexit limiting of our cooperative research and science projects would be a terrible loss. So could you give a bit more detail about the arrangements that are being taken to address the potential gap in funding and research placements, specifically for the long-term vision, which is so important looking at ecological issues? And is there also a need to look further at the provenance of our native species and work to develop resilient strains of native seeds in the face of disease and climate change? How is the government supporting farmers and crofters to adopt best practice methods of nature-friendly farming? And will this be a consideration in the Agriculture Bill? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you. There were quite a few questions in there, so I will try to address as many of them as I can, and if not, I will commit to get back to the member on the ones that I've missed. I mean, in relation to Brexit, I think because there's still so much that's unknown about that at the moment, I mean, one commitment I would give is that we still fully intend to, we want to keep pace with what's happening in the EU, and we want to continue to have some of the highest standards in the world. I mean, we see that with the likes of our seed potatoes. They're in demand across the world because of the high health status that we have. So that is vitally important to us as we move forward. In relation to farmers and crofters and the support, I think you mentioned the nature-friendly farming. I mean, that's why initiatives that we have so far, such as the climate change champions, and we have Lynn and Sandra from Lynbeck Croft, who were just one of those champions in that group, who really are promoting some of that best practice, and we really want to try and spread the word of that as much as possible, because we have so much going on in climate change and agriculture at the moment. For farming for a better climate, we have a soil regenerative programme, and there is really important work that we want to go on to share and to really get that message out to as many farmers and crofters about what is possible and some of the work that's currently underway. Again, I'm really sorry if there are points I missed, but I will get back to you on those further.
Gail Ross, to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the Minister's statement, and as a keen gardener myself, I am very aware of the importance of plant health and biosecurity and of the need for us all to garden more sustainably. But how can we ensure that gardeners are getting consistent and reliable advice, and how can we ensure they play their part to promote plant health and secure practice?
Minister.
I'm very well aware that Gail Ross is a keen gardener. I think she's got some experience there that could be well shared with us all. But I would say that during the International Year of Plant Health, Scotland's Chief Plant Health Officers team and our Plant Health Centre will be engaging with gardeners and the general public really to raise awareness of biosecurity issues and the best practice that's there to follow. And details will appear on the Chief Plant Health Officers' web pages soon. Last year, we worked with the BBC's Beechgrove Garden to highlight biosecurity issues to a wide audience, and we regularly liaise with stakeholders on biosecurity guidance and advice issues. Now, we always advise gardeners to source plants from a reputable local trader that can advise about where their plants have been sourced from, and we actively promote the European Plant Protection Organisation's Don't Risk It campaign, which highlights the danger of bringing home plants from overseas trips. And I don't think I can really emphasise enough just exactly how important this is, especially when we look at diseases that I mentioned in my statement, such as Xylella, and the impact that they're having across Europe. I think particularly in Italy, where they've completely decimated olive trees and those plantations. We need to do absolutely everything we can to prevent these diseases from reaching our shores.
Mark Ruskell, to be followed by Mike Rumbles.
Thanks. The Minister mentions the excellent work of the James Hutton Institute, but given the loss of international collaborations and funding post-Brexit, and also the urgent need for a climate emergency budget in Scotland, what consideration is being given to restoring the funding support to the James Hutton Institute?
Minister.
I mean, looking forward, we really have to see how best we work with all our research institutes. We want to continue to support them and the valuable work that they do. I mean, a lot of the work that I mentioned in my statement wouldn't have been possible without the research that these important bodies undertake, and they're a key part of the Plant Health Centre. So we have to continue to see how we can support these going forward.
Mike Rumbles, to be followed by Angus MacDonald.
That's the point I want to press the Minister on, because with Brexit we faced a loss of expert scientists who have come to work here. and it threatens to and she said it threatens to compromise our ability to protect Scotland's plants and trees. But how exactly is the Minister planning? I'd like to know how exactly she's planning to tackle this problem, because it is a problem for us.
Minister.
No, the member is absolutely right. I mean, without knowing exactly what the outcome of Brexit is going to be, what funding opportunities are going to exist through that, and whether we'll still be able to play a role in the likes of Horizon 2020, which has been absolutely vital for our research communities, it's hard to know exactly what support will be there. That's why we continue to press the UK government for that information. And obviously we're in a general election right now. We don't know what the outcome of that is going to be, which just continues this uncertainty. And again, we just have to, I absolutely recognise the importance, as I just outlined in the response to Mark Ruskell, about the importance of our research institutions and the valuable work that they do. And that is why we have a close relationship with them, and we will continue working with them to see how we can maintain that and continue to fund them going forward.
Angus MacDonald to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
The Minister will be aware of the threat posed to oak trees from the oak processionary moth. Can she advise if we have had any instances in Scotland and how concerned the Government is about this threat?
Minister.
Thank you. Now, oak processionary moth is a particular risk, but it's more of an animal and plant health risk because of the serious skin irritations and allergic reactions that it can cause. Now, Scotland is part of the United Kingdom oak processionary moth protected zone, and in July this year, following the introduction of oak processionary moth infested trees into England, the Scottish Government further strengthened protection by introducing emergency measures, which has restricted the movement of larger oak trees deemed the highest risk of OPM. Now, similar legislation was introduced throughout the UK. Scottish Government officials are working with other parts of the UK to share intelligence on the scale and distribution of trees imported into the UK, and our inspectors are investigating all Scottish sites where suspect trees have been planted since September 2018. But I can confirm to the member that Scotland has had 6 positive findings. The trees infested have been destroyed, and Scottish Government inspectors have visited 157 sites in total to inspect for oak processionary moth. And as a precautionary measure, pheromone traps were deployed at each of the positive sites, but all of those tested negative for OPM.
Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scotland and North of England high-grade seed potato industry is worth 100 million to the British economy. Just 2 of the top 15 Scottish varieties of seed potatoes currently grown are resistant to the pallida species of potato cyst nematode. Can I ask the Minister what the Scottish Government is doing to support Scotland's leading agricultural research units, in particular the Soil Association Scotland-led Rural Innovation Support Service, who are discussing the latest research on PCN, and will she commit to exploring successful projects in Germany where cases of PCN have been greatly reduced, of which could be of huge benefit to the Scottish seed potato industry?
Minister.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm grateful to the member for that question because, as I highlighted in my response to Claudia Beamish, this is such an important sector to Scotland and is very valuable, and that is why maintaining that high health status of our seed potatoes is vitally important. And of course, the news about potato cyst nematodes well, reached the news this week. Now, in line with the EU directive, Scottish Government scientists test all fields to be used for seed potato production for the presence of cyst nematodes in the soil, and only fields which test clear for PCN can be used for seed potato production. Our research partners, the James Hutton Institute and Scotland's Rural College, undertake research on control strategies, including breeding for resistance to nematodes. And Scotland's Plant Health Centre is working with stakeholders to determine why the problem is increasing and likely future scenarios to inform the industry. Through the Rural Innovation Support Service, a consortium is working to develop innovative control strategies to safeguard the long-term future of our potato industry. And as part of the International Year of Plant Health, one ministerial roundtable event with industry will focus on the threat to Scotland from nematode pests, including PCN. And I wasn't aware of that example that the member raised about what's happening, I think it was in Germany. But of course, I think if there are strategies that are being put in place in other countries, then we have to, of course, look to that and see if that is something that we can learn from. But we do not take these threats lightly, and work is continuing to tackle these problems.
Jenny Gilruth to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This summer I joined members of Markinch Heritage Group and volunteers from the Fife Coast and Countryside Trust to help tackle the issue of Himalayan balsam. Given the Minister's awareness of the devastating effect on local biodiversity that invasive species can have, could she set out how we can increase awareness for local groups and the wider public of such species? And will she join me in commending groups like Markinch Heritage Group in my constituency who help to manage the biodiversity of our countryside?
Minister.
I absolutely do commend those groups because Jenny Gilruth raises such an important point about invasive non-native species. As I said in my response to Finlay Carson, they're one of the biggest threats to our biodiversity. And I think you get more of a sense of the scale of the problem when you look at the financial impact that it has. I think I mentioned this in portfolio questions as well a couple of weeks ago, but it's worth repeating it again because invasive species cost us in the region of £250 million a year in Scotland. So the involvement of communities and local groups is absolutely vital if we ever hope to try and get on top of and tackle this problem. I visited the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, which is a 4-year project, to see some of the work that they do in my own constituency on the River South Esk. And figures from that project show that 342 volunteers took part, 736 kilometres of giant hogweed was treated, and 195 volunteers helped to monitor mink rafts. So again, community involvement and volunteer work here is vital, and I absolutely commend the work of those groups of volunteers in Jenny Gilruth's constituency, as well as in my own and across Scotland, for the work that they do, because we really depend on them to be the eyes and ears for invasive species spread in their own local communities. The member is also right to ask what more we can do to raise awareness and ensure that more people are aware. Scottish Natural Heritage leads on tackling invasive non-native species like Himalayan balsam, and SNH will work with the Plant Health Centre to raise awareness of the issues across networks and among groups to encourage more people to get involved to minimise the threat to our native plants. And I'll give more thought to that as we go into International Year for Plant Health and explore what more can be done with our lead agencies in that regard.
Sarah Boyack.
How is the Government working with farmers and crofters to secure a reduction in reliance on pesticides and artificial fertilisers, given that pollution and agricultural intensification are identified as key drivers of the nature emergency and that fertilisers also contribute to climate change? And what support and education is being made available to local communities on those issues who are involved in gardening and the management of our urban environment to ensure plant health and biodiversity?
Minister.
I thank the member for that question. Now, in relation to what we are doing to encourage a reduction in the use of pesticides, the Scottish Government considers that pesticides should be authorised where the available scientific evidence shows that they do not pose an unacceptable risk to human health, animals and the environment. The Scottish Government promotes a targeted approach to pesticide use, integrated pest management, which enables farmers to protect their crops using a full range of measures, with pesticides being used as sparingly as possible, is already promoted through strategies such as the Pesticides National Action Plan, and we'll continue to work with land managers to further reduce reliance on pesticides, as it's been outlined recently in our programme for government. In relation, I think there was another part to that question there which I didn't quite pick up at the end, but I will contact the member with that information.
Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Could the Minister expand on the role of the first ever Scottish Chief Plant Health Officer?
Minister.
This was a role which we had newly put into place, and I think it shows the value that we place on the importance of plant health, the fact that we created this post, and the fact that we also have the virtual Plant Health Centre. Again, as I outlined in my response previously, the Plant Health Centre really brings together all key stakeholders and researchers so that we really are at the forefront of tackling plant health issues in Scotland.
And Peter Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the failure of the Scottish Government to forward plan, can the Minister confirm that there is a shortage of young trees in nurseries to achieve our target of 12,000 hectares of new forestry planting next year? And are we therefore in danger of importing disease on young trees from abroad?
Minister.
I think this seems to be becoming a bit of a habit, but I think it's a bit rich of Peter Chapman to talk about lack of forward planning. Well, it's a bit hard to forward plan when you have no idea, and other administration, the UK government, will not work with you and will not share that information with you. So trust me, if we were given all that information, it would be easier to plan and to give those kind of answers.
And John Mason.
Thank you very much. We tend to think of woodlands and forests and agriculture as mainly rural issues, but does she think that urban settings have any part to play in maintaining and developing health and numbers of trees and other plants?
Minister.
I would absolutely agree with that. Urban trees are absolutely vital to help mitigate against the effects of climate change, as well as for the aesthetic qualities, and for that reason they're a prominent feature in urban developments. Now, the Plant Health Centre is commissioning a biosecurity project in 2020, which will address the risks that can result from imported trees being planted in these developments rather than domestically produced trees. And the outputs of this project will help us work with local councils and landscapers to ensure that urban plantings continue, but with less biosecurity risks. But I would also add to that as well, when it comes to urban planting and what we're doing in urban environments, that's where projects that we've supported, such as the Community Growing Fund. I visited a project in North Edinburgh Arts where they'd been successful in applying for that funding, as well as when we look at the Central Scotland Green Network as well. Now, that covers 3.6 million people and 86% of Scotland's most deprived areas, and they're really looking to see what they can do to tackle derelict land and as well as promoting active travel. So we absolutely recognise the importance of tree planting, planting hedges and pollinator corridors in our urban areas. And this is a piece of work which we are determined to continue into the future.
Thank you very much to Minister and members. We'll move on now to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion 19922 in the name of Fergus Ewing on sea fisheries and end-year negotiations. And I would call on all members who wish to contribute to this debate to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome the opportunity to set out the Scottish Government's approach to this year's fisheries negotiations. I look forward to hearing all members' views and listening to them, and particularly those representing fishing communities. And I hope all members will recognise the importance of sending a strong message of united support from this debate for the fundamentals in our negotiating positions. I want to highlight some key developments in the past year. We all know the risks and challenges of fishing, and I want to pay tribute to all our fishermen and their families and their resilience and their bravery. The number of accidents and lives lost at sea is simply unacceptable. So in May this year, I founded the Scottish Fishing Safety Group. This forum involves government officials and industry working together to explore all the issues to make fishing safer for everyone working in the industry. And I've already agreed to invest £855,000 to be invested in fisheries safety and diversification. I also want to highlight activity to modernise inshore fisheries. Since 2014, we have invested £4.4 million in inshore research and development, diversification and vessel health and safety, and have acted to enhance our compliance capacity in key inshore waters. Through the EMFF, we have also supported harbour works, ice plants and marketing initiatives which benefit the inshore fleet. And this year, we have committed a further £1.5 million, Presiding Officer, to drive forward implementation of a 2-year project on vessel tracking and monitoring technology. Contracts for that will be awarded before the end of the year. I certainly will.
I thank the Cabinet
Claudia Beamish.
Sorry, apologies, Presiding Officer. I thank the Cabinet Secretary, and it would be helpful to know, in view of this, whether this will include all vessels, which was a debate in the Parliament earlier this year, or whether small and small-sized vessels will have exemptions in view of, say, if they're collecting lobster pots or whatever, because that was a concern that Scottish Labour had at that time.
Fergus.
Well, the aim is to extend it throughout the inshore fleet, starting with the scallop vessels and the framework. There's 2 framework contracts. They're expected to be signed by the end of this year. It's hoped, therefore, that in the spring of next year, the installation can proceed for the REM in those scallop dredgers that are not currently fitted with this equipment. Some have. So this will be a major step forward, and I can give further details of this to Claudia Beamish. I know she takes interest in due course, if I may, Presiding Officer. Stats for 2018 show, Presiding Officer, an industry in generally good health. Whilst the volume of landings decreased slightly, their value was up at £574 million, with the largest increase in both volume and value of landings coming from demersal species. There has been an increase in the number of vessels in the Scottish fleet, largely due to growth in the 10-metre and under fleet, as well as a welcome increase in the number of people working on fishing vessels. This provides an important reminder that there are a lot of jobs and livelihoods depending on the outcome of these annual negotiations. Put simply, we have got a lot to lose. Now, first I want to summarise where we are in this year's negotiations. The scientific advice from ICES has been published for all stocks, and there's no doubt that it is an extremely challenging picture for some of our key whitefish stocks. Reductions are advised for whiting, saithe and hake, and on the west coast, zero catch advice remains in place for cod and whiting. There's some good news in the form of advised increases for haddock and nephrops. The standout whitefish advice for North Sea cod recommends a 61% reduction in catches in 2020. So that poses an immediate and severe choke risk under the landing obligation. There has been more positive news for the pelagic stocks, with advised increases for mackerel, blue whiting and North Sea herring in 2020.
Will the Minister take an intervention?
Yes, I will.
Stuart Stevenson.
The Cabinet Secretary clearly has all the numbers at his fingertip and vast expertise and experience in this. Would it be sensible if it was the Scottish Minister who is to be leading on behalf of the UK on this vital interest? I've said this before, but in the present circumstances where there is a lacuna at the UK government level, it would be particularly timely, would it not?
Fergus.
Well, I don't know Mr Stuart Stevenson as being perhaps overly kind, but I have been a part of the annual negotiations for the last 3 years. This will be my 4th year. I'd like to say I have developed a workmanlike relationship with George Eustace, as well as the UK officials, I believe, and I see at first hand the collaborative approach being taken with negotiations. There is no certainty who will form the UK government at this point. We do not know, nor do the officials know, who a UK minister would be. George Eustace, I've mentioned, is respected, but will he be around? We simply don't know. And in that matter, there is uncertainty. So I do think it would make sense that Scotland should lead this year's negotiations on behalf of the UK. I hope the UK government might agree such a sensible and pragmatic approach that would, I believe, benefit the whole of the UK. And in that spirit, I will write, Presiding Officer, to the current Secretary of State, Theresa Villiers, offering so to do. I was talking about the severe choke risk under the landing obligation resultant from the advice regarding a 61% reduction in cod catches in 2020. There has been more positive news for pelagic stocks, with advised increases for mackerel, blue whiting and North Sea herring in 2020. But of course, the final quotas agreed for next year may not directly translate from the advice. The negotiations themselves are where the final quotas will be set, and these are underway and have resulted in a number of positive outcomes. Firstly, the coastal states pelagic negotiations took place in October, reaching agreement on fishing levels in 2020 for mackerel, blue whiting and Atlantic Scandian herring, ash, which followed directly scientific advice. Now, this is welcome, particularly after last year's drawn-out and difficult negotiations. For mackerel, Scotland's single most valuable stock, this equates to a 41% increase on the agreed limits for last year, and this may deliver a potential benefit to Scotland of around £175 million, particularly if we can increase the volume of landings in Scotland. But again, parties were unable to agree comprehensive sharing arrangements for these stocks, meaning that fishing is likely to go beyond the agreed limits again in 2020, and that is neither sustainable nor acceptable. And yes, I'll give way to Dr. Allen.
Alistair Allen.
I thank the Minister for giving way. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware of the project developed by my constituents, Grant Fulton and Angus Campbell, tracking Atlantic bluefin tuna off the coast of the Western Isles. What opportunity does the Cabinet Secretary see to develop the highly lucrative commercial fishing of this species, which could benefit my constituents in the future?
Fergus Ewing.
Well, I discussed this with members of the Western Isles Fishermen's Association on Friday, the 8th of November in Tarbert. And I do want to support the well-being, diversity and positive development of our coastal communities, including those within Dr Allen's constituency. So a bluefin tuna tagging project is underway. I'm delighted that this programme has been awarded an EMFF grant through the Western Isles Fisheries Local Action Group. And it's this government's intention not only to support a tagging programme but to seek a small quota primarily designed for sport and recreational fishing activities. Going back to the negotiations, if I may, Presiding Officer, the annual meeting of the North East Atlantic Fisheries Commission took place last week in London. The agreement was reached on a number of proposals which aim to ensure conservation and optimum utilisation of fishery resource in international waters of the NEAFC regulatory area. Now, a significant achievement this year was the tabling of the proposal by the EU, which would have introduced a cap on all parties fishing mackerel in international waters. This was one of my key objectives and was a move led by Scotland, as, in the absence of full party agreements for the pelagic stocks, uncontrolled fishing in international waters is the biggest risk of unsustainable fishing. Now, whilst not adopted this particular year, I regard the tabling of such a proposal as an extremely positive step and one that I hope and intend for us to work with other parties to enact in future in the interests of sustainable fisheries. This year's EU-Norway negotiations are underway in London as I speak, with a second round scheduled to take place in Norway at the beginning of December. With regards to TAC setting for the jointly managed stocks, Scottish officials are working tirelessly with colleagues across the EU and Norway to establish the necessary multinational response to deal with the very difficult science advice. But I'm especially encouraged that both industry and the NGOs have indicated their support for our negotiating strategy for our overall objectives from these negotiations. That applies in particular to the two-stage approach to the challenging North Sea cod situation. Not that many years ago, Presiding Officer, such a united position between the industry and the NGOs could not have been achieved. So much credit to all who have been involved and who have agreed to set aside differences to put forward a common front. There are also a number of quota exchanges with Norway, and again our priority is to secure a fair and balanced exchange of fishing opportunities which does not disadvantage our own vessels, whilst mitigating choke risks. Now, turning to EU-Faroe. The EU-Faroe consultations are scheduled to take place on the 9th and 10th of December. Agreement in this forum allows quota and access opportunities to Faroese waters for our whitefish fleet. Now, my aim is to ensure a balanced outcome for Scotland, with all elements of this agreement truly on the negotiating table, and any arrangements for 2020 delivering a fair and proportionate outcome for all sectors. Yes, certainly.
No, the Cabinet Secretary is actually in his last minute. Thank you. But I can allow you a little extra time for the interventions you've taken, Cabinet Secretary. Sorry, not this time. Thank you. We are rather short of time. I'd ask everybody to bear that in mind. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, perhaps in closing I can respond. The December Council will bring negotiations to a conclusion, Presiding Officer, and I'll cut some of the detail, if I may here, except to say that it's a tough job that lies ahead. And I'm conscious that the conduct of these negotiations against the backdrop of the UK election doesn't make these things any easier than they already are. In conclusion, I look forward to listening to the debate. I hope it's a constructive, rational, positive, evidence-based, forward-looking, forensic, helpful and courteous debate. And I hope that my hopes are not too highly set.
Thank you for concluding so quickly, Cabinet Secretary. But you haven't moved the motion.
So moved. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It may be useful for everyone to know that we are in fact short of time for this debate, so I hope the Cabinet Secretary can address points in closing, and brevity would be appreciated. And I call Peter Chapman to speak to and move Amendment 19922.2 for up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I will move the amendment in my name, and I will hope to be courteous throughout this debate. It has been a pleasure and a privilege to continue to work with the fishing industry this year, and I am pleased to speak on their behalf in this important debate and to open for the Scottish Conservatives today. It is great to see that Peterhead Port goes from strength to strength following the opening of the new market. Fish landings topped 200 million for the first time ever last year, and it continues to consolidate its position as the largest whitefish market in Europe. It is also hugely encouraging that landings by Scottish vessels increased in worth last year with a gross value of 574 million. And it is good to see an increase of 24 vessels from last year due to a growth in the 10-metre and under fleet. The number of fishers working on these vessels has also increased, up 1% from the previous year. However, work must continue to be done to continue to encourage newcomers to the profession. Now, there will undoubtedly be difficult negotiations on quota this year, especially for cod. But the quota for pelagic fish it looks very healthy, and we've seen a big rise in the quota for mackerel for the next year. So there is some mixed news on that front, Presiding Officer. And Presiding Officer, whilst this is welcome news that landings are up for the industry as a whole, the same cannot be said for the seafood processing industry. Now, my region has the largest share of Scotland's processing sector, providing over 4,000 jobs. However, it is worrying to note that the number of processing sites has decreased in the North East by almost 25% from 2010 to 2018. And as I have previously stated in the chamber here in the last couple of years, the North East is losing business and jobs to Humberside, where fish processing is growing. And I strongly encourage the Scottish Government to support the processors by reducing business rates and water and effluent charges. Briefly.
Stuart Stevenson.
Is the member aware of the research from Seafish which shows that the rateable value per square metre in Peterhead and Fraserburgh is almost identical to that on Humberside?
Oh. Peter Chapman.
I am indeed aware of that, but the situation in Aberdeen is completely different, where the business rates are almost double in Aberdeen. So, if they were relieved from such high rates, fish processing businesses could reverse the current decline, creating more jobs around the country and especially in Aberdeen City. And to quote Jimmy Buchan, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Seafood Association, he says, "We have rich resources in our seas and a modern fleet of fishing vessels with highly skilled skippers and crews. Now we need to match that onshore in well thought through business initiatives that will encourage business and our youth to build this industry up for the long-term benefits of the communities it operates in." And he goes on by saying high operational costs, squeezed margins, limited funding, access to raw material, political uncertainty in the current climate, and further uncertainty over a further Scottish independence referendum are all business risks, restricting investments and growth. Presiding Officers, the seas around Scotland contain some of the most productive, valuable and diverse fisheries to be found anywhere in the world. And the opportunity to claim up to 200 nautical miles of the EEZ will allow Scotland to take back control of this rich resource, ensuring our own fishermen can increase their catch and their share of our fine fish. Surely not even the SNP can argue it is fair that 60% of the fish in our waters are caught by foreign boats. The route to securing a larger proportion of the fish that are found in Scotland's waters is the UK, of course, becoming an independent coastal state when it leaves the EU, and therefore being able to control access to waters and fishing opportunities, enabling the UK to decide who catches what, where and when in UK waters. I will.
Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, the withdrawal agreement negotiated by the current Prime Minister with the EU does nothing to take back control of our waters. If Mr Chapman disagrees, can he read from the agreement the extract where this is agreed? And since it doesn't exist, Does he not agree with me that the fact is that Boris Johnson has simply kicked the can down the road and any negotiation has not been carried out now, may never be carried out, and will be fiercely resisted by the EU in any circumstances?
Peter Chapman.
It's absolutely astonishing to hear that SNP Cabinet Secretary come away with such absolute nonsense. We are the party who will take the UK out of the EU. We are the party that will take fishermen out of the common fisheries policy. His is the party that will take us straight back in. The SNP have nothing to say to our fishing communities in the North East. Be in no doubt, the SNP's stated objective is to stop Brexit and rejoin the EU as quickly as possible and take us straight back into the CFP. So the message to our fishermen is very clear. The SNP will do everything they possibly can to keep you in the hated CFP. No chance of taking control over EEZ. No chance of redressing the balance where we only catch 40% of our fish in our waters. No chance of coming up with solutions to the landing obligation. And no chance of growing the prosperity in our rural communities. I won't have no time. Presiding Officer, even the Scottish Government's own report, published in 2018, showed that leaving the CFP has the potential to double the raw material caught by the industry in Scotland and could result in an increase of £500 million to the economy and the creation of 5,000 jobs. At this side of the chamber, we fully realise the great opportunity that Brexit provides to the fishing industry by leaving the CFP. Leaving the CFP behind will improve sustainability by allowing us to move from a system based on historical fishing activity to zonal attachment, a modern and evidence-based method of allocating shares according to where the fish stocks are located now and not based on the fishing practices of 30 or 40 years ago. The critical path to securing these economic benefits is that the UK becomes a sovereign coastal state and regains full control over its own waters. And we must do this by December 2020 to allow us to take our place at the table at next year's talks on fishing opportunities for 2021. And this will allow the UK and Scottish governments to determine who gets what, where and when in our waters.
You could close, please.
Access by the EU fleet to our waters will no longer be an automatic right, as it is under the CFP, but something that will be subject to annual negotiations, as is currently the case between the EU countries that are not bound by the CFP, such as Norway. So can I just finish, Presiding Officer?
I thought you had, Mr. Chapman.
Oh, you think I have finished?
Yes, I think you have.
Well, I hadn't quite, but I will bow to your greater knowledge, and I will finish there. Thank you.
We are short of time. I'm already in the point of having to curtail backbench contributions. So 6 minutes, please, for Colin Smith to speak to and move Amendment 19922.3.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, it's not the focus of today's debate. We have heard already that once again the forthcoming annual fisheries negotiations are taking place with the issue of Brexit casting a shadow over them. So I want to touch on that issue first. Whether you believe the sector is better served in or out of the EU, no one can disagree that the way Brexit negotiations have been handled over the past 3 years has given little certainty to our fishing communities and the wider sector. If we do leave the EU, we don't know on what terms that will be, with the prospect of a devastating no-deal still hanging over us. And frankly, claims that Brexit will get done by agreeing the current withdrawal agreement on the table from the Prime Minister is just not credible. It is simply the start of the process. We don't know what trade deals will be negotiated in the future and what compromises will be made. It's also important to reflect on the fact that the impact of Brexit on the fishing sector isn't just related to quotas and catches. There are wider implications throughout the supply chain. Currently, more than 4,500 EU citizens work in the Scottish fishing industry, with EU citizens making up 58% of the fish processing labour workforce. The end of freedom of movement will have a potentially devastating impact on processing, a sector that Peter Chapman has already highlighted is under pressure. Likewise, leaving the single market poses a threat to the sale of Scottish fish. In 2016, the UK exported 1.6 billion of fish and fish preparations, of which 71% went to EU countries. Any new tariffs or delays caused by increased border checks will have a profound impact on trading, particularly with perishable products like seafood. We can't ignore these wider implications when discussing the impact of Brexit on the sector and the communities that rely on them. But, Presiding Officer, The short-term challenge we face and the topic for debate today is the current round of quota negotiations. Our starting point is the scientific advice from the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. The proposed uplifts it recommends in total allowable catch for northern haddock, plaice and mackerel will be welcomed by the sector. But there are, as the Cabinet Secretary said earlier, challenges in that advice, in particular the proposed reduction in total allowable catch for North Sea cod. The industry have raised concerns about the high risk of cod becoming a choke species and impacting on the industry's ability to catch other species. So the reference in the Scottish Government motion to work with the sector to try to find solutions to this issue is important. But where interventions are made to address the issue of choke species and mixed fisheries, they must be carefully targeted and well thought through. If any additional quotas are secured for this purpose, it's critical they are used for that purpose. In the negotiations in the weeks ahead, prioritising sustainability will not only be the right thing to do from an environmental perspective, it will be crucial to the long-term viability of the industry. The fishing sector provides thousands of jobs, often in some of Scotland's most fragile rural communities, and generates more than £300 million a year in GVA, while the processing sector contributes more than that again. If fish stocks are not managed responsibly, these jobs and this income is at risk. Whether we're in or out of the common fisheries policy, we need to ensure that decisions on quotas will deliver this sustainability and are grounded in robust scientific evidence. There's no doubt fish stocks in the industry would benefit from more accurate and reliable scientific evidence base. For example, last year it looked like only 318,000 tonnes of mackerel would be allowed based on the scientific advice. That rose to 770,000 this summer and concluded at 920,000. Had the cuts followed the advice given at the time, it could well have damaged the industry, arguably unnecessarily. It's critical that we are led by scientific evidence, but for this to work, there must be shared confidence in the science behind any recommendations, and that will be key in determining a way forward when it comes to cod quotas this year, with the Scottish Government's proposed approach on cod, which has secured consensus from the sector and NGOs, welcome. When we come to quota distribution, however, further down the line, the social importance of the sector must be taken into account, ensuring that small boats and those rooted in their communities are supported. Quota consolidation remains a major challenge in the sector, and it's a barrier to delivering the full social and economic benefits it can provide. In some island communities, local authorities have taken their quotas into public hands and lease it to the fishing communities, ensuring that they cannot be traded away. Crucially, this also allows them to lease the quotas in a way that meets local needs and achieves the maximum benefits for their areas, for example, by prioritising local fishermen or new entrants. Looking beyond catching, we need to consider how to grow the sector more broadly by developing fish processing capacity and providing a more localised supply chain. There's also a great deal more to be done with quota negotiations to prevent overfishing. There's been a failure to invest fully in fisheries science and to develop comprehensive fisheries management plans, and many of the aims of the inshore fisheries strategy are still unfulfilled. Better vessel tracking and monitoring systems, which the Government promised and were supported by this Parliament in last year's debate, will be important to addressing illegal activities in Scottish waters. But progress has been slow and there is a need for appropriate exemptions. Presiding Officer, fishing is a key sector to Scotland's economy, but it's also at the very heart of our coastal communities. In my home region of Dumfries and Galloway, the fishery sector is worth more than £9 million in GVA, while the wider marine sector is worth more than £100 million. The region has a thriving shellfish sector, and indeed has the UK's largest scallop port in Kirkcudbright. But the region's also experienced tragic losses at sea, with the loss of crew members on boats such as the Solway Harvester and the Marielle. These tragedies remind us of the incredibly dangerous conditions our fishermen often face. I therefore want to place on record my admiration and respect for the bravery of those workers and pay tribute to those who have lost their lives at sea. Presiding Officer, in concluding, during and beyond the current quota negotiations, there is a need to strengthen Scotland's fishing industry and the jobs and growth it provides, irrespective of whether we are in or out of the EU. We must ensure that the sector is managed in a way that maximises its social and economic benefits, while protecting its long-term future and preserving Scotland's marine environment based on sound scientific advice. Securing the best possible sustainable quotas during these negotiations is essential, but it is only one part of the work that must be done to develop a strong and sustainable fisheries sector for the future generations. I therefore move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
I now call on John Finney to speak to and move Amendment 19922.1 for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer, and I do move that amendment in my name. And But to quote from it, that the segment that says recognises Scotland's commitments under EU legislation to ensure that the marine environment is in good ecological status and that fishing stocks reflect maximum sustainable yield. Now, it's Article 2 of the Common Fisheries Policy that sets the overarching objective to ensure that fish stocks are rebuilt. I think that's an important word, rebuilt, to a level which can produce maximum sustainable yield. And just for the avoidance of doubt with that, meaning as productive as they can be without being unsustainable in the long term. And that was an objective by 2015, or at the latest by 2020 for all stocks. Now, the point in this objective is not to limit economic activity, but to allow the recovery of fish stocks which have collapsed, such as the inshore herring stocks, and create more productive seas. Ultimately, this is in the best interest of the environment, fishermen, and a country generating revenues from its seas. Now, in 2019, and following last year's debate, the EU negotiations set North Sea cod quota 25.4% above scientific advice, and cod on the west coast at 1,735 tonnes when advice was for 0. Now, that's something that the Cabinet Secretary specifically said he negotiated. Now, as well as with many other stocks, whiting, herring in the Celtic Sea, etc. Now, in the North Sea, this decision is part of what has led to the Fisheries MSC certification being revoked in the year and was really in no one's long-term interest. So, when the government motion talks about challenging scientific advice, maybe the Cabinet Secretary can firm up and specifically that in his summing up, please. Now, the true level of... Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Stuart Stevens.
Is the member aware, we heard at the North East Fisheries Development Partnership, that this year, of the 4 strands of research, 3 are not to be relied on this year. Now, that is, I think, a one-off, but it does indicate the very real difficulties of understanding and responding to science, which is broadly admitted, at least this year, to be deeply flawed.
John Finney.
Well, I don't know that I admitted any science was flawed, but what the member does know is that I am not a scientist, and I think that people will often select the information that best suits their needs. What I was trying to say with, in relation to the overarching principle of that Article 2 was that we can surely all be signed up to responding positively to when there is scientific evidence and about having a sustainable future. Because the true level of overfishing is likely to be even more severe given that the government has created a bonus uplift quota. And that's to account for the fishermen have to now land that they were discarding, have to land now that they were discarding is supposedly banned. But the discard ban is not enforced and continues, meaning that the total amount of each stock being killed each year is the original quota amount, the quota uplift amount, and the discarded fish. This is pushing our fish populations dangerously beyond sustainable levels. And of course, the recent assessment of progress towards the EU Marine Framework Directive, the assessment found, and I quote here, the main problem is caused by physical disruption of the seabed from fishing gear. So there are many, many challenges, and our motion goes on to say it's concerned that the marine environment is not currently in a good ecological status and that ongoing discarding and quota limits in excess of the maximum sustainable yield for 2020 may result in continued overfishing. We don't know exactly what the Scottish Government negotiating objectives are, but we understand that they're not going to accept advice to cut North Sea cod quota. Now, I'm quoting from many briefings, and I'm grateful to the various organisations that have provided briefings. These briefings are all by practitioners, and I think the role that they play in deliberations is very important. I don't understand this bonanza, and certainly if the people I speak to in the fishing industry were wanting a spokesman, I don't think it would be Mr Chapman, the self-appointed spokesperson, that they'd be looking to, because they want a sustainable future. Now, regardless of their complex reasoning, it's sanctioning overfishing, the only benefits are to big fishing, who argue against science because they make the big profit. And profit, of course, is a factor in any piece of business, but profit at the expense of our maritime resource is to be avoided. The other aspects of our motion, briefly in the short time I have, it reaffirms the call for a robust marine protection regime, including effective vessel tracking, and the Cabinet Secretary has touched on that. Now, open seas have made many reports of illegal dredging and trawling in marine protected areas since last year's debate. Those we feel confident to report on include dredging around the Garavelachs near Oban, the Sound of Mull, Ullapool, Oftura and St Abbs. And it's certainly the view of Open Seas that the government has failed to react to these properly. The illegality near Oban was witnessed and reported 3 nights in a row without any patrol vessel or aircraft stopping it. Likewise, the Sound of Mull, a dredger had been had its publicly viewable vessel tracker switched on. So there are a great number of challenges, and what we want is a sustainable future, not just for those directly involved in fisheries, but also the many jobs onshore that are supported by it. Thank you very much.
I call Mike Rumbles for up to 6 minutes, please.
This is indeed an important annual debate, focusing, as it should, on the annual fisheries negotiations with our partners in the European Union in order to settle the fishing opportunities available to all during 2020. Of course, there is an added factor in these negotiations because, quite frankly, we do not know whether the people of our United Kingdom will endorse the aim of the current UK government to leave the European Union or whether they will reject it. Whatever happens, though, one thing is sure. The December negotiations will affect us, whether we are in or out of the European Union, because even if we've left, we have the transition period which runs to the end of 2020. As Peter Chapman pointed out earlier, 60% of fish currently caught in the UK's exclusive economic zone are not caught by the UK fleet, and while according to the briefing from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, over 90% of the fish caught in Norway's exclusive economic zone are caught by their own fleet. Now, I do notice that there are some who would imply that leaving the European Union will be all sweetness and light. We would gain control once again over our own exclusive economic zone, and surely they say, or certainly imply, that just like Norway, our share of fish caught by our own fleet could jump from 60% to 90% overnight. Well, I must gently point out to Peter Chapman in particular, these are, I'm afraid, completely unrealistic expectations. Of course.
Peter Chapman.
I have never ever said that it would happen overnight. I have never said that, and I have never spoken to a fisherman in the North East that expects it to happen overnight. But over time, it certainly will.
Mike Rumbles.
Well, there we've had it. Over time, we will raise 90%. I just don't believe it. It's just not practical, and that says everything about Peter Chapman. When fishing rights are being addressed, that's why historical fishing opportunities will need to be respected, even if we wanted to. And I don't know anyone who seriously believes this. Perhaps I do now. We couldn't ban all foreign vessels from our exclusive economic zone, even though Peter Chapman might wish that to be the case. If the UK does actually leave the European Union on the 31st of January, Brexit will not be done, because the hard work of negotiating a trade deal with the European Union will just be getting underway. I don't believe for 1 minute that having taken over 3 years to negotiate the exit terms, we can settle all our trade negotiations, including fishing, by the end of next year. Yes, I include negotiating fishing as part of our trade negotiations, because if we leave, we will have to negotiate all our trade with the European Union. And anyone who says that fishing will somehow be magically excluded from this is being totally unrealistic. Of course.
Fergus Ewing.
On that point, I wonder if Mr Rumble shares my concerns that the prospective negotiations over fishing in the event of Brexit would get caught up in the negotiations currently being conducted over trade, and that the result may be that we fear that the UK may sell out a proper deal on fish in order to be able to get some kind of deal on trade.
Mike Rumbles.
Well, I agree. The Minister's hit the nail on the head here, and I've always been sceptical of the claim that our fishing industry would be so much better off as an independent coastal state outside of the European Union because of these reasons. I suspect I would if I had the time, but I've only got 2 minutes left. I'm sorry, I would certainly. You know, it's clear to me that when we negotiate trade deals, we negotiate trade deals. And you can't say to the European Union, we want to negotiate everything, except fishing. That's just not going to happen. Now, I'd like to focus on our inshore waters in the short time I've got left. Members will have received a briefing from the Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation. In contrast to the, quote, seas of opportunity that we've so much heard about, that Brexit offering our fishing industry, the creel fishermen are worried by what Brexit might bring. 3/4 of Scotland's 2,000 fishing boats are under 10 metres long, and they've little to gain and much to lose from Brexit. If our trade talks fail and a no-deal Brexit faces us at the end of next year, they face the real possibility of their fish produce going bad in the lorry parks of Dover as they wait for access to our European markets. To them, Brexit is far from a sea of opportunities. And to quote Alistair Sinclair, the national coordinator, and I quote, "Shellfish are now our main target species, and we are witnessing signs that before long they too could decline dramatically, as has already been witnessed in some areas. We do not need tariffs and lengthy customs barriers as well," unquote. I couldn't agree more, and that's why we do need an inshore perhaps fisheries bill sooner rather than later. Presiding officer, the Liberal Democrats support the Scottish Government's motion and wish the Cabinet Secretary well in the annual December negotiations. It's unfortunate, to say the least, that the run-up to these negotiations are being conducted with the threat, and that's what it is, the threat of Brexit hanging over them. We support the Scottish Government's commitment to respect stock sustainability in relation to next year's quotas and support its efforts to achieve the best possible outcomes for Scotland's fishermen, the wider sector and all our coastal communities.
We now move to the open debate in very strict timings of up to 6 minutes, please. Angus MacDonald, followed by Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So here we are again, 1 year down the line, and another debate on end-year negotiations. However, this one's a bit different, as we're faced with departure from the EU, on the 31st of January, either with a deal including a transitional period, but still faced with the possible nightmare situation of a no-deal. So we know that the EU Commission has released its TAC proposals for 2020 for 72 stocks in the North Sea and the North East Atlantic, and as always there's good news and bad news. There are cuts proposed for 23 stocks important to Scotland's fishermen, and we know that coastal states have agreed on a 41% rise in the North East Atlantic TAC for 2020. For reaching agreement on management measures for mackerel, blue whiting and Atlanto-Scandian herring, and all three have a tax set in accordance with the recommended scientific advice, which is a positive outcome for Scotland, apart perhaps from the 11% decrease for Atlanto-Scandian herring. Unfortunately, though, as I understand it, the Marine Stewardship Council has so far refused to reinstate its eco-label for mackerel, which was suspended earlier this year when the stock assessment was drastically reduced. It was then revised significantly upwards. However, MSC said that they would still not reinstate its sustainability eco-label because of the absence of a long-term management plan. However, despite the MSC's strange stance on mackerel, it's still good news for our fishermen. But while there's good news for mackerel, it's not so good for cod. There's no doubt that the scientific advice continues to be challenging, particularly the risk of a choke in the North Sea fisheries due to the big TAC cut proposed for cod of 70%, which is being discussed this week at the EU-Norway negotiations on shared stocks in London, as the Cabinet Secretary has referred to. So, Presiding Officer, with regard to future fisheries management, we're heading into an unfamiliar situation, with the UK being classed as a third country when it comes to fisheries negotiations with the EU. Perhaps UK officials will find out how Scotland has felt in previous years and decades, sometimes locked out of negotiations in Brussels and left to sit in anterooms and hang about in corridors, while UK ministers with little direct knowledge of the needs of the Scottish industry led on the talks. And we know that even if we leave with a deal on the 31st of January, we'll continue to operate under the EU during the implementation period, but only as a consultee. And the problem with that is that we would not be able to negotiate anything independently until the implementation period ended. So that's far from ideal, and I'm sure it's not what East Coast and Northern fishermen thought they were voting for when they voted to leave the EU. To save the day, however, it's clear that Scotland needs a seat at the top table for key fisheries negotiations. By allowing Scotland to lead the negotiations on behalf of the UK when the December Fisheries Council begins on December 16th, full preparations can be made away from the post-election turmoil in London. With Scotland being the primary fishing nation in the UK, accounting for around 2/3 of UK landing, it would seem to me the obvious choice to lead the UK delegation should be the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy. So, turning regrettably to Brexit and the likely impact on the West Coast, the Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation, that Mike Rumbles referred to earlier, have been consistently warning of the risks a no-deal Brexit poses to small operators for years. And I just hope all fishermen won't be judged on the misled decisions and actions of others. When the REC Committee held a round table a couple of months ago, we heard from Alistair Sinclair of the SCFF, who gave the warning that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, exports of seafood would be held up because of a lack of environmental health officers and vets to provide the paperwork required. He also claimed live shellfish exports to Europe could be disrupted by demonstrations at the Channel from French fishermen denied access to British waters post-EU withdrawal. These risks still hover in the background, given that a no-deal Brexit is still a possibility. But a real concern for fishermen and processors or exporters is the issuing of export health certificates. Now, when the Cabinet Secretary appeared before the REC Committee on the 6th of November, he suggested that there had been talk of an additional 150,000 or 200,000 export health certificates being required, and that would cost between £7 million and £15 million. However, Mr Ewing advised the committee that the UK government had been approached to agree to dynamic alignment, which would allow for the need for export health certificates to be avoided. So if the Cabinet Secretary has time and is summing up, I'd be keen to hear if his counterpart in London, George Eustace, has made any effort to apply to the EU for dynamic alignment, or, as I suspect, is the fishing industry and seafood exports being kept as a bargaining chip. As recently as last Sunday, Tory Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab admitted EU vessels will keep access to Scottish waters in a Tory Brexit trade deal. So much for Boris Johnson's long-promised sea of opportunity for the Scottish fishing industry. So in closing, Presiding Officer, I believe, as I say, the best solution for Scotland is the one suggested earlier. Our Cabinet Secretary should be permitted to lead the UK delegation, not just for the December talks, but also for as long as we remain in the CFP during the transitional period. Thank you.
Call Finlay Carson to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be speaking this debate at this important time in the fishing industry's annual calendar. It's also always a welcome opportunity for members across the chamber to put on record our thanks to our brave skippers and fishermen and our industry representatives who work tirelessly to support the industry in a challenging climate, both meteorologically and politically. 74% of the Scottish fishing fleet are inshore vessels of under 10 metres, and I represent many coastal communities in my constituency of Galloway and Western Fries, where the majority of fishermen work within the inshore sector. And as already mentioned, Kirkcudbright, in the heart of the constituency, is home to the UK's largest scallop port. Therefore, I'm very conscious of the need to protect all our fishing interests. But in 2017, non-UK European fishing boats landed around 700,000 tonnes of fish and shellfish from the UK's exclusive economic zone. That's about 8 times more in weight than our own registered vessels did from the EU EEZ. That equates to a staggering £2.5 billion. That's a massive potential loss of income to our coastal communities. With that in mind, it's incredible that looking back at SNP's track record, that their MEPs backed a report calling for the continuation of the CFP, even after Brexit. And the Scottish Government admitted that they wished to hand back powers to Brussels and I'm not taking any interventions. The Scottish Government admitted they wished to hand back powers to Brussels. And SNP Minister Marie Todd is quoted in the Shetland Times as saying that being a member of the EU meant going along with the CFP. Yeah. And even in the SNP's...
Sorry, Mr Carson, sit down. I hope it is a point of order. Well, you know how I feel about specious points of order.
Presiding Officer, is it appropriate to miscall the activities of another parliament.
That is not a point of order. Please sit down just now. But I do think it is important for members to treat each other with respect in here. And I think in this circumstance, cautiously, please, Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll go back to the... Marie Todd is quoted in the Shetland Times as saying that being a member of the EU meant going along with the CFP. And even in SNP's independence white paper, they said that an independent Scotland, the EU, would be in the common fisheries policy. Make no mistake, if this SNP governments get their way, they will lock our fishermen into the already intolerable CFP. All this in direct contrast to our own Scottish Fishermen's Federation, who want real change, to see the current common fisheries policy and see Brexit as the opportunity to revisit the decision to allow all European vessels to fish between 12 and 200 nautical miles off the UK. Indeed, I'm sorry, I don't have time. Indeed, many see leaving the CFP as a chance to address this situation for the benefit of Scotland's fishing communities. However, I also see it as a real opportunity for change in all our fishing communities, including our inshore fisheries, to improve management and work towards a fully transparent and sustainable industry, while also addressing the need to ensure a healthy, sustainable marine environment. And I was fortunate enough to visit Shetland only yesterday to see the very commendable and impressive way that the various stakeholders have worked together on the marine plan to ensure an economically and environmentally sustainable marine environment. But there was also acknowledgement of the potential £1 billion increase in landings and predicted a positive impact, which has resulted in enough confidence that the local authority are funding a new fish market. I also welcome the Cabinet Secretary's mention of GPS on scallop boats, because in the past I've spoken about the need for new technology on our boats which could play a part in addressing illegal fishing, and therefore I was pleased to see that the UK Government announced a Fisheries Technology Fund which should help transform the industry using research and innovation. And again in Shetland I heard about new satellite and drone technology which will assist in detecting areas of high nutritional levels in the water, which will identify the best location for mussel farms. But at the same time, that technology can be used to better predict where target fish shoals are. And this will make a massive difference when it comes to ensuring that discard bans, where we're reaching the limits when it comes to net technology, can move forward. But these technologies may result in fewer fishermen on our boats, but it shouldn't result in fewer jobs in our fishing and rural communities. So we need to ensure that scientific and technology jobs can be located in these areas, because it gives us a real opportunity to revitalise our coastal communities while also setting the highest standards of marine conservation, which will allow for additional jobs in the industry and an environmentally and sustainably future for Scotland. Presiding Officer, I do wish the Cabinet Secretary well in next week's meetings, because it can play a vital role in not just ensuring fit-for-purpose quotas, but should also be an opportunity to step up the engagement and to deliver the industry's aspirations for the future. As Deputy Convener of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, it's vital that this Parliament plays its part in delivering for a fishing industry and the communities and businesses they represent. We need a successful outcome with a future for jobs, economic activity and sustainable production to enhance our natural environment and deliver for our fishermen and the future of our coastal communities.
Thank you very much, Mr Carson. I call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Claudia Beamish. Mr Stevenson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And my throat may mean I'll sit down early, and you'll welcome that, I'm sure. Let me just pick up the point that Finlay Carson was making. I think his comments are an abuse of parliamentary privilege, and I'll explain why. But we are granted privilege to protect us from the legal consequences of what we say for very particular purposes. The vote that Mr Finlay referred to never took place in the form that he refers to. And the reason is the clerks in the European Parliament recorded the SNP votes incorrectly, and it was corrected within hours of that being drawn to their attention. And therefore, anyone who asserts that it was otherwise, frankly, is abusing the privileges of this Parliament. Having said that, let me congratulate Finlay Carson, and I will join with them on this, so I shake hands across the chamber, having said what I've said, that when he refers to our brave fishermen, there will not be anyone in the chamber here who disagrees with that. We see it appearing in the government's motion. We've heard it from Colin Smith, and we all unite in understanding that. My very first constituency activity after being elected in 2001 was to attend the Fishermen's Mission in Peterhead for the presentation of a Royal Humane Society medal to a fisherman. This fisherman had been on a vessel off the coast of Greenland in, I can't remember if it was January or February, when there was ice on the superstructure of the fishing vessel, and one of the crew members got swept overboard. And this gentleman leapt into the sea, where the survival time was a matter of a few minutes, and rescued this fisherman and brought him back to safety. So that, for the very first activity of me and my constituency, did, for me, reinforce my previous understanding of the risks to which fishermen expose themselves and the bravery that they are prepared to show. Incidentally, the fisherman concerned said he was much more concerned at speaking to the audience who were there to see him receive his medal. And I sort of understand that. Now, to the matter in hand and the end-of-year negotiations, I do think there are, unusually this year, some particular and acknowledged difficulties with the scientific information. We've also got a long-run problem with some of the baselines for the scientific information, which I think it's time the scientists sought to do something about. They acknowledge that these difficulties are. It is not an exact science, let's not pretend that it is, but I think this year we're hearing of particular problems that there are. It's a great delight that Fergus Ewing has such a high regard for George Eustace and the UK government, his opposite number. But I do hope that in the aftermath of an election that we see Fergus Ewing taking the lead if George Eustace is not available, or more to the point, can't get any guidance from a new government. Now, where are we in the whole thing? The Conservative colleagues here are focusing on but one aspect of the industry when they focus on the catchers. Now, I brought to this chamber as a members' debate the Sea of Opportunity because I welcome the Sea of Opportunity for our catchers. But it cannot be disconnected from the seafood sector and the need for wider coastal communities to benefit, should it be that more fish can be caught by our fishermen and fundamentally landed in Scotland to be processed. But leaving the customs union and the single market presents immense challenges for the processing sector. And the processing sector is not just the big processors in my constituency, it's we smokehouses in the west coast of Scotland, where they're a vital part of very small communities. Unlike my constituents, they may employ 1 or 2 EU workers, which are vital to make that local enterprise work. And we're already seeing that workers are not so willing to come to the northeast and to elsewhere in Scotland as they once were. Because of the devaluation of the pound, that's part of it, but the hostile immigration environment promulgated and operated by the UK Tory government. So if we cannot process the industry, and I think thousands of new jobs in processing is utterly fictional at a time when we've record vacancies in the northeast of Scotland in our processing industry, we have to have the same rights and privileges as our friends and colleagues across the Irish Sea in Northern Ireland are being given, where they're allowed to stay in the single market and the customs union. Our competitors and our rivals, and undermining our industry, potentially. Let's just end by a little word about how well prepared the Tory government is for this sea of opportunity and everything that goes with it. 2 days before the end of October, 2 days before the end of October, the UK government still couldn't tell fish processors what label to print and put on the side of fish exports. That tells you something about the shambles of this Tory government's approach to fishing.
Thank you. I call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Alistair Allen. Ms Beamish, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In this year's negotiations, I encourage the Scottish Government to seek the best arrangements for our coastal communities with respect to the pillars of science and sustainability. This coming year is a significant one for our seas as we celebrate the year of coasts and waters and a decade since the passing of the Marine Scotland Act. It will also be a testing year with deadlines for sustainability and environmental status levels, and it may be the year that we exit the EU, though I will be campaigning along with Scottish Labour colleagues for Remain, hopefully with a referendum under a Labour government. So, the philosophy of protection and enhancement of our natural marine environment as an ally of the strong and resilient fishing industry should be at the forefront of this government's approach more than ever. In the context of the State of Nature report and threats to biodiversity and of the climate emergency, I'm very pleased to speak in this debate and to approach it from the perspective of my brief. And I firmly believe that sustainable fishing makes for a sustainable industry, which makes for sustainable communities. I commend those working in the fishing industries for their resilience in these turbulent times and pay respect to them for the dangers they face every time they set sail. Coastal communities can be fragile economies that depend very much on these negotiations and Scottish Government direction, and they must be given certainty of science and the tools to fish appropriately for their local marine environments. In this context, I have some concerns about the request made by Alistair Allen in this debate about possible fishing of tuna, which is here, in my understanding, and the science, due to climate change. The marine environment is precious and a public good, and the intention of the 2010 Marine Act was for our stocks to be managed for public interest in the context of that Act, and to enhance the marine environment as well as protecting it. Our fish stocks are only a renewable resource with proper management. The way to really sustain communities is to manage ecosystems for productivity. It is a sensible option. Everyone wins with clean, healthy seas. Can the Cabinet Secretary give us an update on progress towards managing stocks in line with maximum sustainable yield in his closing remarks? Sadly, as we've heard from John Finney, the issue of illegality has not been resolved. I was disheartened to learn of reports of illegal scallop dredging in St Abbs recently. In spite of the excellent practice by many fishing boats, thanks to Open Seas, who state it is without doubt that overfishing, ongoing illegal discarding and illegal damage to MPAs only benefits a few for a short period of time and is to the long-term detriment of our coastal communities and fisheries. We need Parliament to take this long view and to respond to the challenges in our seas. Can the Cabinet Secretary give any reason as to why Marine Scotland was not able to take action for a full week after the reports at St Abbs were made? And can the Cabinet Secretary also explain why the 1.5 million of EU money committed to resolving this issue in October 2018 has not been fully spent? We should, of course, be utilising any EU funds while they are still available to us, which I hope will be long-term. But whatever the result of Brexit, the EU European Maritime Fisheries Fund is one such valuable resource that has offered support for the just transition of the industry and to support fragile communities. It has made an impact across our country and has been significant in diversifying coastal economies, improving the quality of life in coastal communities and shifting to more sustainable approaches. In the most recent round, the fund enabled businesses to make improvements to processing, storage, take on research projects, maximise global and UK-wide market opportunities, tackle seafood waste and more. And reinforcing the community-led approach to the sustainable development of fishing areas is hugely important. It can open up the industry to the sidelined, empower young people by aiding startups or training for the unemployed, progress family businesses by training partners, and advise smaller fleets on diversification. Can the Cabinet Secretary offer any further assurance that this fund will be replicated in funding and purpose, whatever the Brexit outcome? I will look briefly to the inshore fisheries, as I have been privately approached by those with serious concerns about the future of this industry. And this annual debate is one of the few opportunities to discuss these fishing issues in Parliament. The Scottish fishing industry must be looked at holistically, in my view. It would be an immense loss if Scottish low-impact fishermen and communities pay the price for any government focus on industrialisation of our inshore waters. And I urge the Cabinet Secretary to appraise the impacts of the possible exiting of Brexit on creel fishermen in inshore waters, and to take very seriously the 3-mile limit document issued by the Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation this week, and to consider consulting on this, or indeed on other less broad alternatives. Finally, will the Cabinet Secretary give an update on the commitment to an inshore fisheries bill as promised in 2016? And very finally, I wish the Cabinet Secretary luck with the negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Alistair Allen to be followed by Edward Mountain. Mr. Allen, please.
Presiding Officer, while it may sometimes look like there is a predictable element of pre-Christmas ritual in Europe's annual December fisheries talks, their consequences for livelihoods around Scotland's coastline could not be more serious. And this is true not least in my own constituency. Some 300 people in the Western Isles are directly employed in fishing, with many others employed in processing, haulage, markets, boat repair, restaurants and many other areas of the local economy. The shellfish sector represents a very significant slice of that fishing industry on the West Coast, with major markets in France, Spain and Portugal. Whatever happens between now and the current Brexit deadline of the 31st of January, therefore, access to markets and the ability to transport live shellfish without delays at borders remains uppermost in the minds of most island fishermen. Andrew Charles, co-chair of the Scottish Seafood Association, has warned that Brexit could have a, quote, catastrophic impact on Scots fishermen, with the sector facing an estimated £34 million bill a year to sell their catch to Europe after Brexit, in his view. It has likewise been estimated that additional paperwork and charges alone could cost exporters £160 per sale potentially, and exports of fresh seafood will require additional export health certificates at an estimated cost of at least £15 million totally per year. Now, that's before we consider the impact of the loss of the European Fisheries Fund on Scotland. And of course, there is no guarantee, indeed, there isn't even a clue out there about what, if any, free trade agreement would then be reached with the European Union. The loss of our existing rights to free trade certainly present the imminent risk of new barriers for key Scottish food exports such as salmon, langoustines and scallops. This wider context around the annual fisheries talks, therefore, takes on a new and urgent importance this year, and one which we can't ignore today. The talks underway just now are ones where Scotland must get a fair deal. Clearly, the Scottish Government has every interest in reaching one as far as its limited role in some of the negotiations can take it. There is much already to indicate that this is being done, not least in this year's Coastal States and EU-Norway negotiations, which have provided encouraging results in terms of fishing opportunities for pelagic and North Sea whitefish stocks. October's mackerel consultations resulted in a 41% increase in total allowable catch in line with scientific evidence. It is impossible, however, to divorce the fishing negotiations, as I say, from the politics around them, and it's painfully obvious now how the UK Government seems unable to bring itself to restate in any specific detail many of the promises of a sea of opportunity for Scotland's fishermen which were made at the time of the Brexit referendum. And with that in mind, I must respectfully differ from Mr Chapman's assessment that leaving the Common Fisheries Policy as part of the kind of Brexit he envisages would provide a £500 million increase in the economic value of fishing and 5,000 new jobs. I think some of the claims made, not by Mr Chapman, I should say, but some of the claims made by the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. But I'll take an intervention.
Peter Chapman.
Those figures are figures from the Scottish Government themselves. It's your figures.
Alistair Allen.
My point is that I differ with the assessment that my point is that I differ with the assessment, respectfully, that the SFF have made of the statements by Marine Scotland on that, and indeed of the scenario that they anticipate. In fact, even if an EU-Norway EEA type agreement were reached, something which the UK government has consistently refused to countenance, total fisheries output would be lower by up to 7%, with export values lower by between 0.9% and 6.6% for the different species, due to the effect of tariff and non-tariff barriers, as I mentioned earlier on. What is clear that there is a balance to be struck between increasing total allowable catch, shares or fishing quota, and getting tariff-free trade with the EU. Unlike the UK government, Scotland has consistently offered a compromise option that would achieve that, and Scotland's voice on that and on most other matters, however, continues to be ignored by the UK government. Meanwhile, the UK government's own internal Yellowhammer document on Brexit preparation accepts that following a no-deal Brexit, European fishing vessels will likely continue to fish legally or illegally in Scotland's waters, anticipating that 100 such vessels may continue to be active. Indeed, it becomes very clear that both access to waters and access to markets are going to be the subject of very uncertain negotiation for months, indeed probably for years ahead, with Scotland's fishing communities, as ever, a bargaining chip, just as they always have been in the past for successive UK governments. Our fishing policy, presiding officer, to conclude, should be determined by conservation, by science, by the needs of the industry. And I regret to say, however, I see little evidence to show that Westminster has changed its view of Scottish fishermen, which it clearly views as being just as expendable, to use the Tories' own word in 1970, on the way out of Europe as it was on the way in.
Thank you. I call Edward Mountain to be followed by Richard Lyle to be followed by Lewis MacDonald, and all of you have agreed to cut your speeches to 5 minutes, and I thank you for that. Call Edward Mountain followed by Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and bearing in mind what you've just said, I will cut the comments that I've made about quota and the way things look for next year from my speech. I think it's a real pity that our fishing industry has seen yet another year of negotiation going by, with the UK unable to negotiate as an independent coastal state. It is clear that Scottish fishermen want nothing more than for the UK to leave the hated common fisheries policy and for the UK to take its place at the negotiating table. They know there's a better deal to be had outside the EU. Don't forget that 60% of fish currently caught in the UK exclusive economic zone is not caught by UK fishing vessels. How can that be fair? It isn't. I want to take a moment to remind this government how unfair the common fisheries policy is. On average, EU vessels landed £540 million worth of fish from UK waters between 2012 and 2016. By comparison, UK vessels landed £110 million worth of fish from EU waters in the same period. That's not equitable, and we shouldn't allow our fishermen to be shortchanged. Quota and access rights will still be a central part of UK fisheries, but the UK will have a duty to get the best deal for our fishermen and hopefully see our fishery industry expand. Scottish fish... I don't know who was up first, Presiding Officer. I'll let you choose. The Cabinet Secretary.
It's not, I'm only the arbiter. Who are you taking?
Sorry.
John Finney.
Thank you, President Officer. I wonder if Mr Mountain, and we had the Creole Fishermen's Federation in recently, does he feel that all these views that he attributes to fishermen include the inshore fishermen, with all the damage that's going to be done to their quality product that's going to be exported if we leave the EU?
Edward Mountain.
I think the inshore fishermen are a particularly special case, and I think that it is deeply disappointing that we are going through this session of this Parliament with a government that promised an inshore fisheries bill in 2016 and have now scrapped it. That's what I think is disappointing. Now, Cabinet Secretary, if I've got time.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we've done masses of things to promote inshore fishery, but if a better deal is to be done on fishing, why hasn't it been done as part of the Brexit negotiations? Doesn't he agree that this withdrawal agreement the Prime Minister negotiated contains absolutely no agreement on fishing whatsoever.
Edward Mountain, I'll give you about 30 seconds back.
Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. My comment to the Cabinet Secretary is simple. If you sit back and say it's all going to be doom and gloom and it's never going to happen, it never will happen. Let's make it happen. Let's get on with it. That's what we want to do, and that's what, as a party, we will push for. Scottish fishermen look to Norway and see that in their case, 90% of fish caught in Norwegian exclusive economic zone is caught by the Norwegian fleet. That's what life looks like when you're an independent coastal state outside the hated common fisheries policy. And when the UK has the power to negotiate its own fishing quotas, we'll have the potential to stop bad deals that are presented to us often by the EU. When the UK sits at the table, it will be able to strike bilateral deals with Norway on the Northern Sea and tripartite deal with the EU and Norway on the Southern Sea. I believe that those deals will better serve the interests of Scottish fishermen, and I believe the Scottish Government knows that as well. That's why I welcome their report and believe the figures that they had, which found that leaving the common fisheries policies have the potential to double the fish caught by the industry in Scotland and could result in an increase of £500 million to the economic value of our fisheries and an extra 5,000 jobs. £5 million, 5,000 jobs. We also have a duty to ensure that our quotas and access rights reflect the sustainable goals so that the UK fishing industry as a whole can have a secure future for generations to come. We do not need scientists to tell us that fish are not fixated on borders. They are not Scottish, English, Northern, Irish or indeed Welsh. That's why we need to manage across our borders. And one other comment I would make. I don't believe it makes any sense to force Scottish fishing vessels to land all their catch in Scotland. It's better to encourage them to do so by reducing rates and encouraging processing. That's the way free trade works. Presiding Officer, a sea of opportunity awaits our fishing industry, and the UK government is determined. Well, you might moan about it, Mr Rumbles, but that's what fishermen said. And if you want to moan about it, get up and make an intervention. And any more attempts to frustrate our exit...
He's in his last 30 seconds. Sorry about the invitation.
Well, don't moan then, Mr Rumbles. Any more attempts to frustrate our exit from the common fisheries policies would be more than an insult to our coastal communities across Scotland. Let's get Brexit done. Let's ditch the common fisheries policy and let's rebuild our fishing industry. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I call Richard Lyle, followed by Lewis MacDonald. Mr Lyle is the penultimate speaker in the open debate. Mr
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland needs a seat at the top table for those key fishery negotiations. Now more than ever, in fact, allowing our Cabinet Secretary to lead the negotiations on behalf of the UK, full preparations can be made away from the post-election turmoil in London. That being said, Presiding Officer, I do wish to reflect on some of the salient issues in the debate. Namely, that we follow the best available scientific advice, support a progressive move towards sustainable fish levels for all stocks, maintaining stocks above the safe biological limits, good reproductive health, protecting social economic well-being of our industry and the communities that depend on it. Scottish sea fisheries are now more sustainable than they were in 2007. That is thanks to the approach of this SNP Scottish Government and thanks to the leadership of an excellent Cabinet Secretary. I believe Boris Johnson's bad Brexit deal treads away the long-promised sea of opportunity for Scottish fishing. The Brexit deal commitment to a separate fisheries agreement as part of the economic partnership will mean the UK ceding access for EU vessels to UK waters, accepting tariffs, custom barriers in trade, and fish, seafood, farmed salmon with the EU, once again selling out our fishermen and fisherwomen. It's clear from the political declaration, which states within the context of the overall economic partnership, the parties will establish a new fisheries agreement on inter alia access to waters and quota shares. This is a concession from the UK Government to indicate that access and shares will be, to some degree, be traded away before the annual coast state negotiations take place, where it's clear that the fisheries agreement, in advance of operating as an independent coastal state, will include core determined agreements on access and quota shares. It's already been said, Tory Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab admitted EU vessels will keep access to Scottish waters in a Tory Brexit trade deal, as well as tariffs which will inevitably increase the cost of exports. Seafood businesses will face a range of new tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers such as a significant increased certification requirements and delays at customs due to inspections. Delays will be devastating to the fish industry. As a responsible government, I believe this SNP Scottish Government will do what it can to mitigate the significant risks posed to this potential new trade barriers after Brexit. As some would say, breakfast. The onus, however, very clear on the UK Government to finally start to listen to the legitimate concerns of Scottish business and take the steps necessary to prevent profound economic damage. In 43 years of politics, I've known some hypocrites in my time. Presiding officer, the Tories have been selling out the Scottish fish industry for nearly half a century, whatever they say today. Under Ted Heath in the 1970s, the Tories considered fisheries expendable. Under Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, the UK Government signed us up to the original doomed common fisheries policy. This consigned our fishermen to decades of mismanagement. Then we had Mr John Major's Tories sign up to a revised common fisheries policy in the 1990s, which scrapped vessels and livelihoods in its very heart. In the 21st century, the Tories were attempting to enshrine the common fisheries policy in the European treaties. Don't lecture to me because you did. No, I'm not going to take an intervention. You didn't take some of yours. While the SNP was trying to return controls to the fishing industry, to be fair to the Tories, it wasn't always them. Indeed, successive Westminster governments, Labour, Tory, Lib Dems and coalition have constantly seen Scottish fishing as expendable. When they've taken the chance to fight Scotland, they had the chance to fight Scotland's corner in Brussels, they actively decided not to bother. They didn't attend the European Parliament Fisheries Committee, PACH, for the past 25 years. Labour and Lib Dems have not had a MEP on it for over a decade. Scottish Tories have had no representation since 2014, with a sole Scottish MEP only recently gaining a place on the committee. This tells you all you need to know and who cares about the fishing sector. The SNP will continue to demand the scrapping of the fundamental reform of fundamental reform of the CFP. Presiding officer, much as at stake, we will continue to champion the important issues and fight for Scottish fishermen. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Lewis MacDonald, then closing speeches. Mr MacDonald.
Thank you very much. As members have said, another year ending, another Fisheries Council approaching. The pattern has not changed much since the first session of this Parliament 20 years ago, when I and others here were members of the first Rural Affairs Committee in 1999. It has certainly not changed as much as members around the Chamber predicted this time last year, or even the year before that. We are again approaching what might be the last meeting of the Fisheries Council, which the United Kingdom attends as a member state of the European Union. But then again, it might not be the last such meeting. And we were allegedly there for the last time on that basis last year as well. I'm struck by the fact that the Government's motion today does not actually mention the European Union or the Common Fisheries Policy by name. It talks instead of annual fishery negotiations in the Faroe Islands and in Brussels, as if our bilateral discussions with the Faroese were on a par with our membership of the EU and the CFP. Of course, the negotiations with the Faroes and Norway, and indeed those with the wider group of coastal states in the North East Atlantic, are important. But participation through the UK delegation to the European Union Fisheries Council makes us an insider, not an outsider, in Brussels, at least for one more year. Our talks with other coastal states this year are therefore on a quite different basis from what might apply in the future. And I noted particularly Mr Ewing's reference to proposals for caps on effort in international waters initiated by the Scottish Government, taken forward by the UK and proposed by the EU. Having that kind of clout in international fisheries negotiations cannot be guaranteed in future. The fog of uncertainty then has not yet shifted. Uncertainty for catchers and processors and for seafood exporters, that uncertainty remains unchanged. There have been other changes, though, in the last year. I would like to take this opportunity to record my personal thanks to Bertie Armstrong, who stepped down earlier this year after providing clear and honest leadership for the Scottish Fishermen's Federation since 2004, and to welcome the appointment of Elspeth MacDonald as his successor, as I look forward to working with her, as members of all parties seek to do, on behalf of fishing communities across North East Scotland and beyond. But the largest change which is highlighted today is global warming, and what that means for fisheries in the North Sea and North Atlantic now and into the future. One of the outstanding issues in recent years has been conflict among coastal states over mackerel. And while the quota for mackerel this year is going up, not down, as we have heard, the potential for future conflict remains. Indeed, this week we heard from the SFF that not just Iceland, but also Greenland and Russia were identified as countries whose mackerel catches in international waters may be a cause for concern. One country's overfishing is, of course, another country's increased access. And some of the issues in recent years have been about increased catches within territorial waters as well as in international waters. The truth is, as a number of people have referred to already, rising ocean temperatures mean that who catches what, where, is not and cannot be static, as cold water species migrate to colder waters and warmer water species, like the blue tuna, take their place. The Scottish pelagic fleet will no doubt follow the mackerel into ever more northerly waters. That means that priorities for interstate negotiations in future are bound to change. Countries with which we have previously had very few issues in fishing may become more important, while some of the countries with traditional historic interests in Scottish waters may become less so. Climate change also has wider impacts on fish stocks, not just in North Atlantic waters, but worldwide. And while some in the sector may still be sceptical about scientific advice, the fact is that Scotland is now well placed to give a lead on how to deliver long-term sustainability in a world where that is ever more in demand, not least in promoting partnerships between catching and conservation interests. Achieving maximum sustainable yield is not a one-year wonder in a mixed fishery. It is something to work towards across a number of years. Having that as a goal for fishing in Scottish waters is worthwhile in itself, but it also makes our experience even more valuable in future to sustainable fisheries worldwide, at a time when sustainable management of fish stocks is becoming truly a global challenge. We should not just look forward, Presiding Officer, we should continue to look outwards as well.
Thank you very much. Closing speeches. I call on John Finney, close to the Green Party. Mr Finney, please. 6 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And I think it was my colleague Angus MacDonald said, here we are again, and hopefully we will be here again next year. And like many others in the debate, I'd like to pay tribute to those in the industry, both onshore and off, for providing us with a sustainable food, hopefully in the longer term. Can also acknowledge the Cabinet Secretary's remark in his opening statement about safety, the Scottish Government's investment in safety and diversity, and that's to be very welcome and to be hopefully more of. Now, if I noted him correctly, he said we've got a lot to lose, and my friend and colleague in the debate, Claudia Beamish, talked about the pillars of science, sustainability and public interest, and it's for these reasons that I've on many occasions raised the issue of maritime protection with the Cabinet Secretary and his colleagues, most recently at the Rural Economy Committee. And Cabinet Secretary rightly said the police can't be everywhere and the marine protection people can't be everywhere too. So can I pay tribute to their work? I think they do sterling work. And a fisherman in the West Coast, very helpfully trying to explain things in simple terms to me, said, you know, John, it's like when the traffic department in Dingwall would go to the West Coast to get drunk drivers. By the time they got there, everyone knew they were on the road. And pretty much like the TV detector van of the past too. Now, that's very much the case with the fishing industry too. Everyone knows where everyone else is. There's very few secrets. So if we're really going to manage fisheries in a way that protects the ecosystem and moves damaging fisheries away from fragile habitats and areas used as spawning and nursery grounds, we're going to really have to get our act together. And that support, of course, for protection isn't simply from environmental interests. The Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation, the Scottish Scallop Divers Association, both support a ban on trawling and dredging within 3 miles of the coast and of the West Coast. And many have mentioned this document here, and I commend it to the 3-mile limit by the Scottish Creole Fishermen's Federation. I think it's significant in one of the briefings that we received from Open Seas that they quote that the Scottish Government's own research has found that establishing such a ban would create more profitable landings and greater employment in these fisheries, offsetting any harm done to the trawl and dredge sector and allowing crashed fish stocks such as cod and whiting to recover. Because, of course, if we are talking about a long term, then we are going to have to ensure that it is sustainable, not least in this climate emergency. Now, again, my colleague, Mr Stevenson here, talked about the importance of the single smokehouse in the West Coast. And we do know that, of course, there's considerable employment gained by the inshore fishing fleet, who don't rely on imported labour to maintain their margins of profit. They employ locally, and as the briefing says, our live products achieve up to 5 times more value to Scotland PLC than trawled. Now, I suppose by the very nature of being a resource that's available, it is a very competitive arena there, and I certainly go along with those in SIF to talk about integrating fisheries with other marine activities. I think I mentioned in the debate there that, of course, it's not simply those that are at sea that are involved. And with the thorny question of ongoing negotiations, well, quite self-evidently, those who have the most interest in it should be involved. And I'm a long-time supporter of the Scottish Government having direct involvement in these negotiations. It certainly was the case that the presence in an ante-room or not, or in the room, seems to vary depending on personalities. I, as one who says that fish don't know boundaries, well, the reality of the situation, it's going to be good relationships at governmental level and official level that are going to bring about some of the benefits we all seek. So I am pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary talk of the good relations he has with his opposite number. Now, some of the contributions we had during the debate, well, Mr Chapman, quite frankly, I think my colleague Mr Rumbles did a demolition job there that I can't better, and I think it's very important that we deal with facts. I think it was my colleague Colin Smith that talked about certainty. Any industry wants that certainty. There are many factors that impact on this particular sector, and what they've been given is uncertainty. The thought of valuable produce rotting in a car park in Kent, I find disgusting, the potential waste of food, and particularly given the industry that's gone into delivering that project. But perhaps on a consensual note, in the last minute I have, I would like to talk about a particular fishery. It's a fishery that's grown in great importance, and it's a fishery that sees the Scotland's marine aquaculture industry currently purchase 1 million live wrasse each year for use as cleaner fish for the removal of sea lice infestations on farmed salmon. The importance of raising that is that the capture of wrasse has been undertaken by only voluntary measures. Now, in the short time, I haven't got the opportunity to go into the science of all the challenges there are of the environment where that takes place in, but in a very consensual effort. It forms part of Recommendation 28 of the Rural Economy and Connectivities Report on the aquaculture industry, which said, and I quote here, strongly recommends the Scottish Government considers the need for regulation of cleaner fish to preserve wild stocks and avoid negative knock-on impact into local ecosystems. That's a philosophy we should put right across the fisheries sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Rhoda Grant. Close for Labour. 6 minutes, please, Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by joining Colin Smith and others in paying tribute to the fishing community and remembering the many who have lost their lives in this very dangerous line of work, and therefore welcome the funding for safety measures outlined by the Cabinet Secretary in his opening speech. Presiding Officer, with the current general election in play at this point, it's impossible to say if or when Brexit is going to happen, whether there is going to be a deal that's beneficial to the fishing industry, or whether the deal trades away our fishing rights, or whether there is no deal at all and we crash out It's completely unpredictable, and neither, as Lewis MacDonald said, can we say that this will be our last year that we take part in these negotiations as an EU member state. Who knows? Whatever the outcome, any new quota must be allocated for maximum economic benefit to rural communities, and we need to safeguard it from being traded away, as has happened in the past. Some island communities already lead the way. They have kept quota in public hands and they lease it to the fishing community, and that means it can't be traded away, nor can it gain an inflated value that puts it out of reach of new entrants to the industry. And in order to provide maximum economic impact in remote rural areas, priority should be given to smaller boats that are rooted in their communities. But as many speakers said, there are many downsides to Brexit for the fishing community as well. Access to markets. Mike Rumbles and Alistair Allen talked about that. This is fresh produce, that any delays or bureaucracy can actually mean that it loses value. If not in part, it can lose value totally by delays. So therefore, we need to be very careful about how we trade going forward. Colin Smith made the point as well that 58% of our processing workers come from the EU, and so also do some of our workers at sea come from the EU, and if they are not allowed to remain, that makes an issue for the community, and we need to also attract new workers into the community as well. Can I just maybe flag up, I know I'm winding up the debate, but an issue that hasn't come up in the debate, and that is the issue of gill netters, and flag it up to the Cabinet Secretary as something he may wish to look at in the future. Gill netters use long lines of nets which take up a huge area of sea, basically locking out other vessels. And this is causing major problems up in Shetland, where the fleet is locked out of those areas. Now, the time limit for those nets to be in the water is 72 hours, and nobody's suggesting they shouldn't be used at all. But a reduction in the time they could be left in sea to, say, something around 24 hours would mean that that would free up areas for the other members of the fishing fleet to get access to, and certainly end some of the disquiet that surrounds that. Presiding Officer, we all agree with a discard ban, but it's disappointing that as yet there's no solution to choke species, and Colin Smith spoke about this. We have a mixed fishery, and where there is no quota for bycatch, then the fishing industry can catch the species that they have quota for, that they can legally pursue. We need to look at solutions to this, maybe looking abroad to countries such as Norway to see how they handle this without having their fleet tied up. The Cabinet Secretary suggested that with the cod fishery there might be as great as a 61% cut in cod quota this year. And if that happens, then cod becomes a choke species, as Colin Smith pointed out. Rather than just cut quota, could the Cabinet Secretary maybe pursue other measures that could be put in place that lower the need for a cut of this size? Things like avoiding fishing spawning areas or areas where there are high numbers of juveniles. Lewis MacDonald made the point about global warming, and this could affect cod, because it seems that cod is very plentiful in the North Sea, but not plentiful in the South North Sea. And could they be moving north to find colder waters, just as bluefin tuna are coming into our waters as they warm up? And we need to be switched on to the effect of global warming and how it affects fisheries. Indeed, we need to be switched on much better to the science surrounding fisheries. We discussed the Norway negotiations around mackerel and how the catch changed, the science changed in that regard, meaning a 41% increase this year. The science needs to be accurate, and we need to invest in it to make it so. And we need to ensure that the fishing community have confidence in it, otherwise they will look to avoid keeping with the quotas when they know and believe that they're not correctly based in science. So I would appeal to the Cabinet Secretary to work with the industry to ensure that the science is right. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, there have been years in the debate where fishing negotiations have been all about cutting effort, and tough decisions were taken, and there are still tough decisions to be made. However, we need to recognise that difficult decisions in the past have led to the recovery of stocks, and therefore we need to make sure that we have robust science to back up any cuts. And in closing, I would wish the Scottish Government well in making this case at the negotiations.
Thank you very much. I call on Donald Cameron to close. We can serve for 6 minutes, please, Mr Cameron.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm delighted to close this debate for the Scottish Conservatives. In fact, it's my third year of closing it, and nostalgia is already creeping in. I've already fond memories of Tavish Scott, Stuart Stevenson, even the Cabinet Secretary, jousting over the finer details of various quotas and species. Long may it continue. As I listened to Richard Lyle's historical diatribe, which was, of course, nonsense from start to finish, it was hugely enjoyable nonsense. Fishing is, of course, a crucial industry for Scotland as a whole and for the Highlands and Islands. I've said this before, but it is important to acknowledge that this industry extends beyond the North East and also takes in our inshore fisheries, as many have mentioned, including the shellfish sector. Many of those fishermen and women operate on the west coast of Scotland and are often ignored in the wider political debate. However, today we address specifically, Presiding Officer, the issue of sea fisheries in the end-of-year negotiations, and it is a poignant debate, as this will be, and I truly believe this, our last debate on end-of-year negotiations when the UK leaves the EU and we take back control of our own waters. And that is one of the many reasons that these benches support the deal negotiated by the UK government in terms of exiting the EU and finalised, I've got a lot of ground to cover, and finalised last month. That deal will ensure continuity during the transition period and also ensure a smooth and orderly move to a new arrangement. And the Cabinet Secretary made this point many times about the withdrawal agreement not mentioning fisheries, which I have to say was surprised at, because is it seriously his contention that exiting the EU doesn't also mean exiting the common fisheries policy? And in fact, well, if I could just carry on a second. In fact, the withdrawal agreement itself says in Article 130, it deals with specific arrangements relating to fishery, and also, as we know, it must be read in tandem with the political declaration. And the political declaration at paragraph 71 says, in notes, that the UK will be an independent coastal state. That is the interpretation of both the UK and the EU. It's there in black and white. And I'll take an intervention from the Cabinet.
Cabinet Secretary, Mr Stevenson, please desist from shouting. Yes.
Thank Mr Cameron for giving way. My point is that the Tories say that a better deal will inevitably happen. Well, why hasn't that already been negotiated? They've had 3 years. Isn't it the case that the reason there is no deal at all in the withdrawal agreement on fishing is that they know fine well that they are going to be completely unable to deliver the expectations that they've engendered in the fishing community?
Donald Cameron.
It's a good try, Presiding Officer, but in fact the SNP, of course, didn't back the deal earlier this year and refused still to back a deal that means we will leave the hated common fisheries policy, a policy that has devastated Scottish fishing and the many communities that rely on that industry across Scotland. As the Scottish Fishermen's Federation have noted, leaving the CFP will provide the change in governance to address this situation for the benefit of Scotland's fishing communities. As Finlay Carson said, the SNP said that rejoining the EU would mean rejoining the CFP. The SNP said that in their 2014 white paper. They said that the EU's common fisheries policy provides member states' vessels with access to all members' waters. There's no ambiguity. Deputy Presiding Officer, can I turn to some of the more positive news of the year and in part concur with some of the other remarks made by members across the chamber? It is welcome news that the most recent fisheries statistics show that in 2018 the number of 10-metre and under fleet increased by 36 to 1539 vessels. It's also welcome there's been a rise in the number of fishers employed in the industry in 2018 compared to 2017, with the overall number up by 1%. And of course it's positive news that the value of sea fish and shellfish landed in 2018 increased by 1% in real terms value. However, as the Cabinet Secretary and others have noted, it is clear that deep challenges remain for other parts of the industry, and this must be a cross-party issue to support our offshore fleets. And I have to say I listened with interest to the contributions of Alistair Allen and John Finney, and I represent the Highlands Lions like John Finney, and it was full of doom and gloom. I visited a shellfish processor in Alistair Allen's own constituency about a month ago, and I had a very frank discussion about Brexit. They don't see Brexit as a major barrier. It may produce some short-term challenges, but in the long term, they see an opportunity and to have greater autonomy in the waters that they fish and greater chances to export. I don't have time, I'm afraid, to export their product to new markets. And of course, the Western Isles Fishermen's Association, straight after Brexit, said withdrawal from the EU offers the local fishing industry a unique opportunity to develop a sustainable long-term industry. The Shetlands Fishermen Association, the executive officer, said only in September, give us Brexit as cleanly and as quickly as possible. So all the doom and gloom we've heard today, Deputy Presiding Officer, is in sharp contrast to what the industry is saying. They are optimistic and positive, and so are we. And in just a few remarks of others that I could quickly deal with. Finlay Carson spoke about measures taken to prevent illegal fishing. He spoke about the GPS on scallop boats, and Claudia Beamish mentioned this too. And can I also note the contribution of Lewis MacDonald, who made, I think, a very good speech talking about wider, longer-term issues, global warming, the rise in ocean temperatures, the fact that when we talk about maximum sustainable yield, that's not just for 1 year, but for many years. And I think that he made some very, very valid points. So in closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, it's clear that there are significant opportunities that leaving the EU and the common fisheries policy presents for the industry and the communities that support that industry. Can I take this opportunity to wish the Cabinet Secretary well in the end-of-year negotiations, and can I support the amendment to the motion in the name of Peter Chapman? Thank you.
Thank you. Now calling Fergus to close the Cabinet Secretary till 5 o'clock, please.
May I begin by thanking Mr Cameron for his closing remarks, and indeed all the members that I think in a debate which has largely been constructive, and I do appreciate the support from Mr Smith, from Mr Rumbles and many other members in respect of the hard work in the negotiations. We are fortunate to have some of the most respected officials in negotiation in the fishing world in Scotland, and we will do our very best to get the best result, both as regards our fishing community and regards the future sustainability of stocks. I don't have time to respond to all the points. There have been a very wide range of points, so it's no disrespect to the members involved. And if you do wish to pursue any of these particularly, please do press me on it, and we will have a discussion if you so wish. I very much welcome the support that Mr Smith took in his speech, and there wasn't a great deal, I think, separating us in the stances we took. And equally, Mr Rumbles, in his analysis, I thought displayed a shrewd sense of the difficulties that lie await in the event that, unfortunate event in my view, that Brexit does proceed. Angus MacDonald asked me specifically about the impact of having up to 200,000 environmental health certificates, and if the UK Government had responded to the request that I made, that could be avoided by derogation by agreeing to dynamic alignment. I have no further information from the UK Government. I asked George Eustace at a meeting some weeks ago if they would press for this. They said that if they did, they would be turned down. And I said, how do you know if you don't ask? That is where matters stand. And that could cost industry between £7 and £15 million. And really many members, I think Mr Finney did this, certainly Dr Allen did this, Mr Stevenson did this, Angus MacDonald did this, said if there is delay in shellfish in particular from small operators, small businesses in the West Coast and places like Lough Fyne, where I was just yesterday, and Elaine White of the Clyde Fishermen's Association has made this exact point, the goods become valueless. The businesses face bankruptcy. This is disastrous. And as someone who has visited in the last, I think, 9 days, Harris, Campbelltown and Portree, I can say, and I think Mr Finney would agree, that in the West Coast, many people in the fishing community are not ardent Brexiteers, quite the opposite, actually. And I think the point needs to be made that fishing around the coast is diverse. It's not homogeneous. There's many, many aspects to it, and it's wrong to present it as if opinion is a monolith. That is not the case. I'm very sorry, I want to cover points. Both Mr Finney and Mr Beamish made a great deal of points about, broadly speaking, sustainability and conservation. And just suffice it to say 3 points. Firstly, the principles that we adopt to approach our negotiations include sustainability of stocks. And nobody loses more than fishermen if fish are fished out. Nobody is a greater loser than fishermen in respect of future generations. So that's one of the 4 guiding principles governing our negotiations. Secondly, I mentioned that the NGOs supported the position that we adopted in our negotiation stance just back at the FMAC meeting on the 11th of November, and that's a first. And I think that's a good thing, and that shows that the approach we're taking is sustainable. And finally, I'm happy to have a further discussion if Mr Finney wishes about a RAS. I don't have time to answer it now, but I'm aware of the committee report, and we take the concerns very seriously, and that's not for today, but I'm happy to meet with him if he so wishes about that. Could also say, and I think it was, I think it's Ms MacDonald referred to Bertie Armstrong, and I think I should also say that I respected Bertie's service over a long period of years, and his leadership. We did disagree, but we did so without rancour, and I'm working very closely with his successor, Elspeth MacDonald, who is an excellent ambassadress for and leader of the SFF, and that's right and proper that we work closely. We work closely with them. My main task is to secure the best deal in the negotiations. The point I made about leading the British delegation is a serious one. It's not meant to be either provocative or frivolous. It may well be that in the immediate aftermath, 2 business days, I think, after the election, that the British government will really not have been formed. We are here. We are continuity. I've been there. I've done it. And we'll stand ready to take on that responsibility. It's a matter of agreement with the UK government, but the offer will be made. Now, in the last few minutes, I just want to really, in an act of kindness, suggest to the Conservatives that there is just a fundamental flaw in their whole message to the fishing community. And it's very simple, really. They're promising the earth, the moon and the stars to fishermen in Scotland. That's how it's perceived. That's what they're doing, and they've been doing it for 3 years now, every day, every week, every speech, every debate. But what have they negotiated? What has the Prime Minister negotiated? Well, he's negotiated an agreement, a withdrawal agreement. But, what does that say about fishing? Where's the deal? Well, all it is an agreement to try to agree something in the future. Now, an agreement to agree, and I'm a lawyer so I can say this without fear of contradiction, an agreement to try to agree something is not a contract. It is not a legally binding agreement. There ain't one. And yet today the Tories present this withdrawal agreement as certainly delivering enormous benefits. They present it as a done deal, a contract binding on both the UK and the EU. Well, they don't like this, but there's a lot more, so please do listen. Okay? Now, Presiding Officer, in the withdrawal agreement that the Prime Minister negotiated, there is no deal. There is only an intention to seek a deal. Not only is the deal not done, it ain't yet begun. Where in the withdrawal agreement does it say that the EU will yield 1 tonne of quota? Where in the withdrawal agreement does it say that any EU countries will cease to argue and argue determinedly for access? Nowhere in the deal. And the reason is very simple. The UK government knew fine well that it would be utterly impossible for them to negotiate the deal that they've promised to the fishing communities in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK. The negotiations on a fishing deal have been caught up in the trade deal. And once that happens and the two become concurrent, there will be tremendous pressure on the UK government to do a deal on trade by yielding on fish. Fish will be snagged, enmeshed in a post-Brexit net of their own making. So, It is to assert that the deed is done, the promises will be delivered, is an exaggeration of Trumpian proportions. It is propaganda that will come back to haunt them. At a time, presiding officer, when Britain needed in negotiating terms a Metternich, they ended up with someone like Inspector Clouseau instead. And they will repent at leisure, believe you me, in the months to come.
Thank you. That concludes our debate on sea fisheries and end-year negotiations. Can I, as our next item of business is a committee announcement, can I call Claire Adamson, convener of the Education and Skills Committee?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Education and Skills Committee published its report on science, technology, engineering and mathematics learning experiences in early years education today. I appreciate the opportunity to highlight some of its findings to the Parliament this afternoon. Firstly, can I thank the 50 S1 girls who took part in the hackathon here in the Parliament on the committee's report this morning. It was one of many events aimed at imploding the myth that computing careers are not for girls. There was so much talent in that room today, and what they produced to promote the committee's recommendations is simply phenomenal. The committee decided to focus its inquiry on 3 to 7-year-olds because in early fact-finding evidence, it was suggested to us that young people as young as 7 have set ideas about what jobs they can and can't do because of their gender, their ethnicity or their social circumstance. The committee is aware that this is a long-standing and systemic issue. We are also aware that for the kind of inclusive economic growth needed for the fourth industrial revolution, progress needs to be made in the uptake of STEM subjects. So the committee's inquiry has looked at what progress makes a real impact, including scrutinising what progress has been made towards the aims of the Scottish Government's 2017 STEM strategy. Improving teacher and early learning practitioner confidence in the STEM disciplines is key, particularly in disciplines of technology and engineering. The committee heard consistent evidence of lack of confidence from practitioners in these areas. We also learned that internet connectivity in some schools is a barrier to teaching computing and other disciplines. In addition, the committee heard that limited resources have meant that some teachers and some parents pay for materials needed for lessons. When looking at differences of opportunity based on level of deprivation and gender, we found that sustained long-term interventions in nurseries and schools, extending out to the local community, were crucial in making meaningful change. We also heard of a myriad of STEM initiatives. The challenge is to ensure that the work of talented, motivated people keen to promote STEM can in time translate into STEM learning experiences being core to the education of all children and young people in Scotland. For example, we heard that small initiatives are often based in the Central Belt and do not have the resources to undertake work further afield in rural areas. In addition, there is a self-selection bias sometimes where only schools and nurseries already interested in STEM seek learning experiences from these initiatives. And finally, we heard of the value of interdisciplinary learning, including in supporting, improving literary skills, numeracy skills and other core elements in the curriculum. We have made a series of recommendations for change, some for the Scottish Government, some for Education Scotland and some for our regional improvement collaboratives. Given the importance and relevance of the issues the committee has been grappling with, I hope members across the Parliament have an opportunity to look at these recommendations. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And we're going to turn now to consideration of Business Motion 19949 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out revisions to tomorrow's business. Could I call on Graham Day to move the motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No member is asked to speak on the motion. The question therefore is that motion 19949 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. Turning to decision time. The first question is that Amendment 19922.2 in the name of Peter Chapman, which seeks to amend motion 19922 in the name of Fergus Ewing on sea fisheries and end-year negotiations be agreed? Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 19922.2 in the name of Peter Chapman is yes 20, no 72. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is the amendment 19922.3 in the name of Colin Smith, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Fergus Ewing be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 19922.3 in the name of Colin Smith is yes 86, no 6. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. And the next question is that amendment 19922.1 in the name of John Finney, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Fergus Ewing, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 19922.1 in the name of John Finney is yes 6, no 75. There were 11 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And the final question is that motion 19922 in the name of Fergus Ewing as amended on sea fisheries and end-year negotiations be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. Vote on motion 19922 in the name of Fergus Ewing as amended is yes 86, no 6. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of Stuart Macmillan on Road Safety Week 2019. We'll just have a short pause while members and ministers change seats.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.